Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was working the late shift at the Sinclair off Route 212, the one just past the feed store. It was a Tuesday in October, pretty quiet, like usual. Nights out there got real still once traffic died down, and sometimes I wouldn't see a car for an hour. I was supposed to close at midnight, but I usually started my cleaning early, mopping the coffee station and checking the cooler around 10 just to kill time. The cameras above the register were old, grainy black and white screens, 4 of them split on a monitor mounted behind the counter. They ran all the time, and I'd gotten used to half watching them out of boredom. I could see the parking lot, the pumps, and a wide shot of the inside aisles. It was around 11:20 when I first noticed something off. The pumps outside looked darker than they should have. Not like the lights had gone out, but like the edges of the camera feed were fuzzy, shadows bleeding inward. At first, I figured maybe condensation on the lens, but then the fuzziness started pulsing, like static trying to push its way through. A minute later, all 4 screens cut to full static, just loud snow. I tapped the side of the monitor out of habit, even though I knew that wasn't how it worked. When the picture came back, I caught something strange. The outside camera showed the roofline, lit up with this faint glow, like someone had parked a floodlight above the canopy. But when I stepped out from behind the counter and looked out the actual windows, the lot was normal, dark, empty. I stood there for a while, trying to see if maybe a truck had pulled up without me noticing. Nothing. When I looked back at the screens, the glow was gone, just black sky again. I kept watching after that. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. A few minutes passed, then the picture broke up again. This time, the cameras inside flickered too. The aisle shot froze, showing the chip's display doubled over itself like 2 overlapping images. The coffee station camera blanked to white for maybe half a second, and then everything went dark, just long enough for me to think the power had cut. When the feed returned, I checked the timestamp at the corner of the lot camera. It said 11:36, but when I looked at my phone, it was only 11:27. I thought, maybe the DVR system had glitched, jumped ahead on its own. But the thing that bothered me was what those 9 minutes should have shown. I'd been standing right there the whole time, watching the screens. I didn't black out, I didn't move, nothing. But the system was acting like that chunk of time had already happened. I tried to reset the monitor, cycling through inputs, but it stayed locked on 11:36. Outside, the lot was still empty. That quiet, out there kind of empty, no cars, no crickets, no wind through the flags on the poles. Then another thing hit me. The hum. You don't notice it until it's gone, but those pumps make this constant low buzz when they're powered on. It's background noise, always there, and I realized I wasn't hearing it anymore. I opened the door, stepped halfway out onto the mat, and the silence pressed in hard like my ears weren't working right. No bugs, no highway noise, not even my own footsteps echoing right. Just that stillness, thick and wrong. I went back inside, locked the door, and stood behind the counter with my arms crossed, pretending I wasn't shaking. At 11:42, the lot camera flared white, brighter than before. Not a flash, but a steady glow filling the whole frame. It looked like the roof of the station was glowing from above, like something big and round was sitting just out of sight. The pumps looked washed out, their shadows stretching in weird directions. I craned my neck at the front windows, but outside, nothing changed. Just blacktop under the canopy, lit by the same old sodium lamps. I watched that glow on the monitor for maybe 10 seconds, and then the screen cut again. When it came back, the timestamp said 11:51. My phone said 11:42. That's when I actually started pacing. I checked the breaker box, thinking maybe the system was screwed up from a power surge. Everything was normal. Lights steady, the cooler humming in back. But when I passed the candy aisle, I noticed something small and stupid that made my stomach drop. Every single bag of chips was leaning forward, like they'd all shifted at the same angle, as if the shelves had been tilted. I put one back upright, turned away, then looked again. It had tilted forward again, like it hadn't wanted to stay propped. I left them alone after that. By midnight, the cameras seemed to settle. No more static, no more jumps. The hum of the pumps returned, faint but steady. When the clock finally rolled over to 12 on both my phone and the monitor, I grabbed my keys and locked up without even counting the register. I didn't tell anyone that night. I just drove home with the radio turned up too loud and parked in the driveway with my hands locked on the wheel for a while. I worked 2 more shifts that week. Nothing else happened, but the timestamps on the cameras never synced again. The DVR always ran 9 minutes ahead of everything else. I was working the late shift at the Sinclair off Route 212, the one just past the feed store. It was a Tuesday in October, pretty quiet like usual. Nights out there got real still once traffic died down, and sometimes I wouldn't see a car for an hour. I was supposed to close at midnight, but I usually started my cleaning early, mopping the coffee station and checking the cooler around 10 just to kill time. The cameras above the register were old, grainy black and white screens. 4 of them split on a monitor mounted behind the counter. They ran all the time, and I'd gotten used to half watching them out of boredom. I could see the parking lot, the pumps, and a wide shot of the inside aisles. It was around 11:20 when I first noticed something off. The pumps outside looked darker than they should have. Not like the lights had gone out, but like the edges of the camera feed were fuzzy, shadows bleeding inward. At first, I figured maybe condensation on the lens, but then the fuzziness started pulsing, like static trying to push its way through. A minute later, all 4 screens cut to full static, just loud snow. I tapped the side of the monitor out of habit, even though I knew that wasn't how it worked. When the picture came back, I caught something strange. The outside camera showed the roofline, lit up with this faint glow, like someone had parked a floodlight above the canopy. But when I stepped out from behind the counter and looked out the actual windows, the lot was normal. Dark. Empty. I stood there for a while, trying to see if maybe a truck had pulled up without me noticing. Nothing. When I looked back at the screens, the glow was gone. Just black sky again. I kept watching after that. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. A few minutes passed, then the picture broke up again. This time, the cameras inside flickered too. The aisle shot froze, showing the chip's display doubled over itself, like 2 overlapping images. The coffee station camera blanked to white for maybe half a second, and then everything went dark, just long enough for me to think the power had cut. When the feed returned, I checked the timestamp at the corner of the lot camera. It said 11:36, but when I looked at my phone, it was only 11:27. I thought maybe the DVR system had glitched, jumped ahead on its own, but the thing that bothered me was what those 9 minutes should have shown. I'd been standing right there the whole time watching the screens. I didn't black out, I didn't move, nothing. But the system was acting like that chunk of time had already happened. I tried to reset the monitor, cycling through inputs, but it stayed locked on 11:36. Outside, the lot was still empty, that quiet out there kind of empty. No cars, no crickets, no wind through the flags on the poles. Then another thing hit me, the hum. You don't notice it until it's gone, but those pumps make this constant low buzz when they're powered on. It's background noise, always there, and I realized I wasn't hearing it anymore. I opened the door, stepped halfway out onto the mat, and the silence pressed in hard, like my ears weren't working right. No bugs, no highway noise, not even my own footsteps echoing right. Just that stillness, thick and wrong. I went back inside, locked the door, and stood behind the counter with my arms crossed, pretending I wasn't shaking. At 11:42, the lot camera flared white, brighter than before. Not a flash, but a steady glow filling the whole frame. It looked like the roof of the station was glowing from above, like something big and round was sitting just out of sight. The pumps looked washed out, their shadows stretching in weird directions. I craned my neck at the front windows, but outside nothing changed. Just blacktop under the canopy, lit by the same old sodium lamps. I watched that glow on the monitor for maybe 10 seconds, and then the screen cut again. When it came back, the timestamp said 11:51. My phone said 11:42. That's when I actually started pacing. I checked the breaker box, thinking maybe the system was screwed up from a power surge. Everything was normal. Lights steady, the cooler humming in back. But when I passed the candy aisle, I noticed something small and stupid that made my stomach drop. Every single bag of chips was leaning forward like they'd all shifted at the same angle, as if the shelves had been tilted. I put one back upright, turned away, then looked again. It had tilted forward again, like it hadn't wanted to stay propped. I left them alone after that. By midnight, the cameras seemed to settle. No more static, no more jumps. The hum of the pumps returned, faint but steady. When the clock finally rolled over to 12 on both my phone and the monitor, I grabbed my keys and locked up without even counting the register. I didn't tell anyone that night. I just drove home with the radio turned up too loud and parked in the driveway with my hands locked on the wheel for a while. I worked 2 more shifts that week. Nothing else happened, but the timestamps on the cameras never synced again. The DVR always ran 9 minutes ahead of everything else. I was out in the woods later than I'd planned that evening. I'd gone up to Huntley Ridge, a patch of public land about 20 minutes outside of town, where I usually set up near the creek line. Deer move through there often enough that it's worth the hike, but I hadn't had much luck that season. It was early November, cold but not freezing, and the sky was clear when I set out. By the time the sun dropped, I was still on the stand, sitting quiet, hoping for one last chance before heading back. The woods always shift at that point. Daytime birds settle down and the night ones start up. Crickets, frogs, owls, the distant bark of a fox. It's not silence exactly, but a change in rhythm. I'm used to that. But this time the sounds didn't just change, they cut out. It was sudden, like somebody had thrown a switch. 1 second the night was alive with noise, and the next, nothing. Not a leaf moved, not an insect buzzed. Even the air felt still. I sat there, hand resting on the stock of my rifle, thinking maybe I just zoned out, but the quiet stretched on too long. It wasn't natural. That's when I noticed the light. It was faint at first, barely visible between the trees to my left. I thought maybe it was someone's lantern or a camper's headlamp, but it didn't behave like either. It pulsed, soft and steady, almost like a heartbeat. First a pale green, then it shifted into a dull orange, then to a bluish tint. It never cast light on the ground or the tree trunks around it, just glowed in the air, self-contained, as if it didn't belong to the space it was in. I lifted my rifle, more out of instinct than intent. The scope gave me a better look, but the moment I focused on it, the glass fogged from the inside. Not like condensation on the outside you can wipe away, but a cloudy haze spreading across the lenses. I lowered the rifle, checked it, breathed across the eyepiece. Nothing. Perfectly clear. I lifted it again, lined up the scope on the light, and it fogged instantly. That made my stomach twist in a way I can't explain. I tried walking a little closer, maybe 20 paces. The light didn't move, but the colors shifted quicker, almost flickering, though never bright enough to light the trees. My boots barely crunched on the leaves. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I crouched near a fallen log, keeping the rifle down this time, just watching. The glow pulsed slow again, in rhythm with my own heartbeat, or maybe that was just in my head. It stayed there, steady, while I tried to make sense of it. I thought about walking right up to it, but something in me said no. Minutes passed. I couldn't tell how many. The cold crept in, but I didn't move. My phone was in my jacket pocket, and I pulled it out to try and record, but the screen stayed black. Not dead, just unresponsive. The button clicks didn't work. I pressed the power, tapped the screen, nothing. I shoved it back, and when I looked up, the light had dimmed to nearly nothing, just a faint shimmer, like it was slipping away. Then all at once, it was gone. No fade, no flicker, just gone. And the forest woke back up. Crickets started, a barred owl called from somewhere down the ridge, and the air seemed to move again. My ears almost rang from the noise returning after that stretch of silence. I sat for a while longer, rifle across my lap, trying to convince myself it was some trick of the eyes. But the fogging scope, that stuck with me. I've hunted for years in every kind of weather, and I've never seen optics fog from the inside, only the outside. When I finally made the walk back to the truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woods looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling something had been there, watching. My phone booted up just fine once I reached the clearing by the lot, full battery, no issues. The clock read nearly 40 minutes later than I thought it should. I drove home slow, headlights carving through the empty back roads. Everything around me looked the same as always. Barns, mailboxes, the turnoffs I knew by heart, but the night felt different. Heavier, somehow. I couldn't stop picturing that light pulsing between the trees, colors shifting like it didn't belong to any lamp or flame I'd ever seen. When I got home, I checked the rifle again. The scope was perfectly clear, no fog, no haze, just glass. I cleaned it anyway, more out of routine than necessity. I kept thinking about how it only fogged when I looked at that light, never when I aimed at the dark woods or the open trail. I haven't told many people. When I mentioned it to my neighbor, he laughed and said, I probably saw swamp gas or some camper messing with glow sticks. But there's no swamp up on Huntley Ridge, and I know what glow sticks look like. They don't pulse. They don't silence the whole forest. I still hunt there, but I don't stay as late anymore. If the woods start to feel too quiet, I pack up. Some part of me can't help glancing through the trees every time I'm there, waiting for that faint, color-shifting glow to pulse back into sight. I was out on Crooked Lake before sunrise, same as I'd been doing for years whenever I had a day off. It was late September, a Monday, and the air had that sharp edge to it that meant fall was just starting to settle in. I'd gotten up around 4, packed my cooler, and trailered the John boat down the gravel access road while the sky was still black. By the time I pushed off, it was about 5:15. The shoreline lights from the cabins were faint, most of them shut off for the season. Out on the water, it was quiet in that way that feels heavier than silence. No motorboats, no people, just the occasional splash from a carp rolling near the reeds. I anchored maybe 30 yards from the north bank, set my tackle box on the bench seat, and cast into the dark. The thing about that lake is it's usually never flat. Even with no wind, you'll get little lapping waves, especially if there's a breeze higher up in the trees. That morning, it was weirdly still. The water was like glass, so when I made my first cast, the ripples from the bobber spread out forever. I remember thinking it was almost too calm, like fishing in somebody's bathtub. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, switching lures, sipping coffee from a thermos. I just put a line back in when I noticed the surface around the boat had started moving. At first, I thought a school of fish was pushing underneath, but it wasn't random. The water was making rings. Big, wide circles, perfect as if somebody had dropped stones in from above, but they were spreading outward from all around me, not just one spot. The boat rocked in this steady rhythm, like something under me was shifting the whole surface at once. I leaned over the side, shining my headlamp down. No fish, no bubbles, just concentric ripples, overlapping each other but still somehow symmetrical, as if the whole lake had decided to pulse. I sat frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the boat, watching it go on and on. Then the light changed. I don't mean the sun, dawn wasn't even close yet. It was still pitch dark, stars bright overhead. But suddenly the surface lit up, pale white, like a reflection you couldn't trace back to a source. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. Hanging above the boat was this sphere, but not shining like a lamp. It had a glow to it, soft, almost hazy around the edges. No sound, no flicker, and up just hanging there maybe 50 feet above me. The strangest part was its reflection. On the water, I could see it trembling, the edges breaking apart with every ripple. It looked realer in the reflection than in the sky, if that makes sense. Like the lake believed it was there, even if my eyes didn't. I set the rod down without reeling in, slow as I could, not wanting to rock the boat. My first stupid thought was drone, but it was too still, too perfectly suspended. No blinking lights, no blades, nothing mechanical about it. The air felt heavy, like when a thunderstorm's about to break, except the sky was clear. I don't know how long I sat staring at it. My watch said 5:42 when I first noticed, but when I blinked, it was gone. Not floated off, not dimmed, just gone. 1 second hovering above me, next second, nothing. The reflection disappeared with it, and the ripples, those circles that had been spreading under the boat, vanished all at once. The surface went dead flat, calmer than any lake has a right to be. My bobber wasn't even swaying. I grabbed the oars and spun the boat around, scanning the sky. Nothing. Not a single trace. I thought maybe it had drifted behind the tree line, but the tree line was a good quarter-mile off. My chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. I pulled anchor right then, didn't care about the tackle, just yanked the line up and rowed hard for the launch. Every pull of the oars echoed louder than it should have. I kept looking back, half expecting that glow to appear again, either over the water or in the trees. When I hit shore, it was 6:03. The horizon was just starting to tint gray. I sat in the truck with the heater blasting, hands gripping the wheel, waiting until the sun was all the way up before I drove home. The weirdest part, the thing I can't get around, is the time. My watch jumped from 5:42 to 6:03 without me noticing. It wasn't like I spaced out and lost track. It was like the minutes just weren't there. When I blinked and the sphere was gone, so was 20 minutes. That was the last time I ever fished Crooked Lake before dawn. It started one night in late September, just after harvest. I'd finished supper and was walking the fence line, like I usually did before bed, checking that the gate latches were secure. The air was cool, no wind at all, and the sky was clear enough to see a scattering of stars. Out in the pasture, my herd wasn't where they normally would have been. They were all bunched up tight in the back corner, the one closest to the tree line. At first, I thought maybe a coyote had passed through, or they'd heard something in the woods, but they weren't facing the trees. Every single one of them had their heads tilted back, looking skyward. It was so unnatural, I stopped dead on the dirt path. Cows don't do that. They'll watch a predator, sure, or a vehicle pulling in, but this was different. It was like they were transfixed. A couple of them even let out these short, uneasy moos that didn't sound like their normal low calls. When I followed their gaze, that's when I saw it. Above the barn, maybe 30 feet over the roofline, there was this glow. Not bright like a spotlight or harsh like a floodlight, just a soft, bluish light, almost like the glow you see off a TV in a dark room. It didn't flicker or pulse. It just hung there, perfectly still, like a ball of haze. I stood frozen, halfway hidden by the fence post, watching. The barn roof was dark, no reflection, and the ground around it stayed shadowed. The glow didn't seem to touch anything beneath it. It just floated, quiet, motionless. The cows stayed packed together, still staring, not moving from their corner. I tried to convince myself it could be a drone, maybe somebody's kid messing around, but it wasn't moving at all, not even a drift, and there wasn't any sound. Out here, you'd hear the whine of propellers clear as day. After maybe 5 minutes, I don't know for sure, it felt longer, the glow faded. Not like it shot away or blinked out. It dimmed slow, like someone turned a knob down until there was just night sky, and stars above the barn again. The cows finally shifted, some lowering their heads, others wandering a few feet like whatever tension had been holding them snapped loose. I stayed out there a long time, just listening. Nothing but crickets and the far-off yip of a fox. Eventually, I walked back to the house. The next morning, I went out early to check on everything. The cows were scattered normally, grazing near the creek. The barn looked fine, but the old windmill by the corn crib, something about it made me stop. It was facing north. That might not mean much, but the thing has been stuck pointed east for years. The bearings froze up sometime around 2016, and I never bothered fixing it because the tower's half rotted anyway. It takes a good hard gust to even make the vanes twitch, and there hadn't been any wind the night before. Not even a breeze. I climbed up partway on the frame, checked the blades. They were stiff as ever, rusted solid. No way they'd turned naturally. But the whole head of the windmill had rotated, not just a few degrees. It was turned a full 90, like something had physically grabbed it and swung it. I didn't mention it to anyone. The cows acted normal that day. The barn was fine, and by all accounts, life just went on. But I know what I saw in that pasture. I know how quiet the night got, how still that glow hung over the barn, and I know damn well that windmill couldn't have shifted on its own. I was standing at the bus stop on Willow Creek Drive, same one I'd been using for years, when the first streetlight went out. It was a Tuesday in late February. Cold but not brutal. The kind of night where you breathe and it doesn't quite make clouds, just a faint trace in the air. The subdivision was quiet, rows of beige houses with trimmed hedges, driveways filled with parked SUVs, a few porch lights scattered like breadcrumbs. I'd worked late and missed my usual ride, so I was stuck waiting for the 9:40 bus, which is usually empty enough that the driver knows me by name. The stop was a simple green pole with a small metal sign, no shelter, just a patch of sidewalk near the corner where Maple intersects. The street was lined with those tall orange sodium lights, the ones that buzz faintly when it's really quiet. They gave the asphalt that weird amber color. I remember glancing down the stretch of road, it's straight for a good half mile, and seeing every lamp glowing evenly, a neat little row. That's when the one closest to me clicked off. I thought it was a fluke at first. They do burn out sometimes, but then the next one down the road went dark, then the next. Each one snapped off in order, one by one, like dominoes, traveling away from me, down the line toward the bend. The sound was strange, less of a click and more of a short, hollow pop, 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 pop. The darkness rolled down the street in a perfect sequence until every lamp on the block was gone. Suddenly, it was dark in a way that street never is. No headlights, no porch lights bright enough to fill the gap, just the faint glow of the sky reflecting off thin clouds. I could make out the silhouette of the houses, the empty road, the little shape of the bus sign, but it all looked wrong, flatter, quieter, like someone had turned the volume knob of the world down. That's when I saw the white shape. It wasn't obvious at first, just a brightness against the dim sky, gliding silently overhead. Oval, but not clean, edges sort of hazy, like it was glowing without actually giving off light. It moved steady, not fast, but there was something off about how it traveled. It didn't bank or sway like a plane, didn't pulse like a drone, just a smooth glide right above the street as if it had been waiting for the lights to cut out. I craned my neck to follow it, heart thumping in a way I didn't like. There was no sound, not even the faint hum of an engine, nothing. Just my own breathing and the quiet of a cul-de-sac gone dead. The air felt heavy then. Not colder, exactly, but like the atmosphere had thickened. Even my jacket felt heavier on my shoulders. I turned in place, following the shape as it slid past above me, drifting farther down the street. For a moment I thought I saw faint ridges or seams along its underside, but they blurred before I could focus. Then, just as suddenly as they'd gone out, the lights snapped back on. Every single one. Not in sequence, not one by one, just all at once, the whole street flooding with orange glow like nothing had happened. I blinked against the brightness and looked back up. The sky was empty. No white oval, no glow, just clouds and a faint trace of stars near the horizon. I stood there, frozen, probably looking like an idiot. My bus was still 5 minutes away. I kept turning my head, scanning the rooftops, the spaces between houses, even behind me across the lawns. Everything was ordinary again. The kind of ordinary that felt almost staged. That's when I noticed the houses. Every window I could see was dark, not just a few. Every single one. The whole block looked uninhabited. It wasn't like that when I first walked up. I remember at least 2 TVs flickering through living room curtains and one kitchen light on over a sink. Now, nothing. I stared at a split level across from me where an old guy named Ray usually sits in his recliner with the blinds half open. Gone. The house was blacked out. My stomach twisted in a way I couldn't explain. I shifted on my feet, pulled my phone from my pocket, and hit the power button. The screen didn't come on. Dead. I could have sworn I had at least half a charge when I left work. I tried again, holding it longer. Nothing. I tucked it back away and just stood there, clutching the strap of my bag, waiting. The street felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. About 30 seconds later, maybe less, maybe more, it's hard to say, lights started coming back inside the houses. One by one, in no clear order. A porch lamp flicked on 3 doors down. A TV glowed faint blue behind curtains. Kitchen windows lit up with that yellow-white LED brightness. Within another half minute, the neighborhood looked alive again. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I yanked it out, and the screen lit up. Full battery, no missed calls. Headlights crested the bend just then, the bus groaning toward me like nothing had happened. I stepped on and nodded to the driver, a heavyset guy named Richard. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes forward, both hands tight on the wheel. His knuckles were pale. The bus was empty, except for me. As we pulled away, I glanced back through the rear window. The streetlights glowed steady, lined up like soldiers, amber halos over the asphalt. But for a half second, only a half second, I thought I saw a faint white glow slide between two rooftops before it vanished behind the trees. I didn't look back again the rest of the ride. I was working the late shift at the lighthouse that night. I kept the logbook propped open on the desk beside me, the pages already filled with neat lines of weather reports and ship sightings. It was one of those calm coastal nights. Cool air, low tide, a faint mist hanging just above the surface of the water. The beam of the lamp swung in its endless rhythm, white light cutting through the fog and vanishing into the horizon. I'd already made my routine notes for the evening. Wind direction, visibility, no vessels in range. Normally, that would have been it. Most nights blend together, honestly. Quiet stretches broken only by the creak of the old metal stairs or the occasional crackle of the radio. But around 12:30 a.m., something caught my eye out past the rocks. At first, I thought it was just another fishing trawler too far offshore to hear. A faint green light low on the horizon. I reached for the binoculars, expecting to see the outline of a boat, maybe the mast light swaying in the swell. But when I focused, it didn't look like a vessel at all. The light didn't stay still. It pulsed. Not sharp like a flash, but slow, dim to bright, bright to dim, over and over, like it was inhaling and exhaling. The mist around it seemed to shift with each rhythm, almost like the glow was pushing the fog outward before pulling it back in. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, and checked again. Same thing. A strange green shimmer, no shape behind it, no structure, no sound. Just that odd, steady breathing pattern. I wrote it down in the logbook. Green light sighted east horizon, not ship. My handwriting looked shaky. The longer I watched, the more it unsettled me. It wasn't far from where the main shipping lanes cut through, but the Coast Guard radar showed nothing in the area. I even flicked on the radio to channel 16 and listened. Silence, except for the hiss of static. The glow expanded, stretching wider across the horizon, then contracted back into a single point. It did this over and over, but irregularly, sometimes slow, sometimes faster. It reminded me of the way a jellyfish moves underwater. For a moment, I wondered if it was some trick of the atmosphere, maybe moonlight refracting in the fog. But there was no moon that night. The sky was dark except for scattered stars. I thought about calling it in, but I hesitated. We're supposed to report everything unusual, but this didn't feel like something I could even explain properly. How do you phrase, "the ocean looks like it's breathing"? I kept watching, leaning against the railing outside the lantern room. The air smelled like salt and wet stone, the only sound the surf crashing against the base of the cliffs below. I realized my hand was gripping the binoculars too tightly, my knuckles pale in the dim reflection from the lamp. Then, as quick as flipping a switch, the light disappeared. I blinked, adjusted focus, scanned the entire horizon. Nothing. Just darkness and mist rolling over the waves. For a second, I wondered if I'd imagined it, but when I turned back toward the desk, the entry in the logbook stared back at me. Green light sighted east horizon. The ink was still drying. I sat down, keeping the binoculars in my lap. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring out the window. The beam of the lighthouse kept sweeping, steady and mechanical, illuminating nothing but open water. I waited for the green glow to return, but it didn't. By 2 a.m., I gave up scanning the horizon and just sat with the logbook open, listening to the creak of the tower in the wind. Every few minutes, I'd glance up, half expecting to see it again. But the ocean stayed empty, as if nothing had ever been there at all. I was hiking alone in the Bitterroot Mountains last September. I had a few days off work and decided to head out by myself. No real plan besides covering as much ground as I could before the weather turned. I'd done solo hikes before and didn't think much of it. I started early in the mornings and usually set up camp by late afternoon, giving myself plenty of daylight to work with. On the third day, the sky stayed overcast from morning on, but it wasn't threatening rain. Just gray and still, the kind of weather where sound carries strangely. I'd been following a ridge trail that wound up toward higher elevation. Around mid-afternoon, I stopped for water and noticed something faint in the distance. At first, I thought it was an electronic watch alarm or maybe some piece of gear I'd left on. A steady beeping sound, high-pitched, sharp, mechanical. Beep, beep, beep. Always the same length apart, always the same tone. I pulled out my phone, checked my pack, even clicked through the settings on my GPS. Nothing. The sound wasn't coming from me. It felt too regular to be anything natural. It wasn't woodpeckers, wasn't dripping water. It reminded me of hospital machines or old digital alarm clocks. Just too clean. I stood on the trail for a while, listening. It was faint, but definitely coming from farther up the ridge, maybe half a mile away. I told myself not to go toward it. The smart thing would have been to keep walking. But curiosity won out, and I left the trail. The forest was thick up there. Lodgepole pines spaced close together with deadfall covering the ground. Moving through it was slow and loud, every step snapping twigs or crunching pine needles. But the beeping stayed steady. It didn't get louder or softer, just constant, like it was waiting. The weird part was how the sound didn't seem to shift with my position. Normally, when you follow a noise in the woods, it changes as you move around trees or climb over rocks. This one felt fixed in place. No echo, no distance drift. Just that same tone, like it was being piped straight into the air. By the time I reached a small clearing, the hair on my arms was standing up. The trees opened suddenly into a rough patch of grass and stone, maybe 40 feet across. No trail, no old campsites, no sign anyone had been there recently. And hanging in the center, at least, that's the only word I can use, was a glimmer. It wasn't solid, more like a shimmer of heat above asphalt, but metallic. The light bent around it, warping the view of the trees behind. Edges of silver or chrome flickered in and out like they were there 1 second and gone the next. The beeping seemed to come from it, though the sound didn't match its size or distance. My eyes kept slipping off it like it didn't want to be looked at directly. I took 2 steps closer, and that's when it changed. The shimmer pulsed once, brighter, and then the beeping cut off mid-note. Not a fade, not a slowdown, just gone. The silence afterward felt too heavy, like the whole clearing was holding its breath. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. The glimmer thinned and stretched until it was gone, like watching steam disappear. In less than a minute, the clearing looked completely normal. Just rocks, grass, and a few stunted trees. I stood there a long time. I even circled the space twice, checked for equipment, buried wires, anything. I found nothing. When I finally made it back to the trail, I realized I couldn't hear birds anymore. No insects either. The forest was dead quiet for the rest of the hike back down. That night in my tent, I kept waking up, thinking I heard faint beeps out in the distance. Every time I sat up, there was only silence. I left the mountains the next morning instead of staying another day like I'd planned. I never figured out what I walked into in that clearing. We were halfway through the third pull on the span when the rain stopped, like someone had shut off a faucet. Name's Ryan. I work for County Electric. Been a lineman for 12 years. That night, a cell had tracked in quick, heavy, fast-moving, the kind you watch on the scanner and know the phones at the office will start ringing. Around midnight, we got the report. A feeder had tripped somewhere between pole 47 and the substation. No houses down, just a big strip of rural line and a couple of farms. We loaded the truck, grabbed the double hot sticks, and drove out in a line of trucks like we always do, lights turning the rain into streaks along the road. The odd things began before we even got set up. The radio in my rig started cutting in and out with this thin, high static that none of us could tune away. Marco, my ground man, said it sounded like interference from a passing storm cell and shrugged. He's older and less wired for fuss, been on crews since before I was born, so when he shrugs, I try not to freak. The scanner was busy with weather reports, lightning strikes, and somebody somewhere calling that an automated breaker had tripped. It all sounded normal for a night like that, except for the way the static would climb in frequency every few minutes, and the way the rain, which had been steady on the truck hood, would stop in a perfect circle over the tree line and then come back hard. Like the storm itself had teeth. We set the bucket under pole 47 and raised up. The wind was a living thing by then, gusting and wrenching at the truck, even on the outriggers. You learn to ignore the elements until you don't, and the first 10 feet felt like routine. Seat locked, harness clipped, hot gloves on. The lights on the dash flicked in the rain. The floodlight on the boom cut a cone through the dark. Marco talked through his headset. "Ryan, you good up there?" He was a voice I trusted. I told him I was ready. Up in the bucket is the kind of isolation you don't get anywhere else. You speak to the ground over a throat mic, and the world below becomes a model. Trucks, cones, orange vests. Up there, you're small and exposed. You feel the line under your hands in a way that's the only thing that keeps you pointed at the work. That night, the line felt wrong. It wasn't sag or tight. It hummed under the gloves, a deep, steady vibration through the towers that I've felt before when the system's healthy. But this was stronger and steady in a way it shouldn't be, with the breaker open. I was finishing the second clamp and thinking quick about the third when my radio went blank. Not static, just nothing. The little green receive light on my handset glowed, but there was no other voice, no dispatcher telling us to hold, no check-in from the crew behind us. For a moment, I thought the headset had popped off. I tugged it back into place and called down, "Marco, can you hear me?" He answered, but the delay from the tower's feeds made his voice thin and far. He said, "Yeah, we got you. Power's still out on this spur." Then there was that thin hiss, and his voice cut. And then the rain stopped. It didn't taper. The drops just stopped midair, and the world was reduced to the sound of the bucket's motor and my own breathing. You think storms are noisy no matter what, but that silence was complete, almost heavy. I could make out the blood bass of the feeder under me, the line's tone, and the tiny squeal of ceramic on post. All the small mechanical noises you never notice until everything else falls away. I looked up out from under my hard hat and saw it move across the cloud deck. It was pale, like the inside of a fog bank lit from within, and it drifted slow and lazy against the black. Not a pinpoint, not a streak. Big, a patch. Enough to eat several constellations if there had been constellations to see through the clouds. It had a shape, a soft oval with edges that kind of trailed like steam blown by a fan. It moved so slow I thought maybe it was a low cloud feature riding the airstream. Then lightning lanced through the bank like a photographic flash, and for an instant I saw the outline. When a cloud lights up, it lights everything in it. That flash was like focus. There was a form inside that lighter patch, and it was wrong. The silhouette had straight edges here and there, corners that shouldn't be in a cumulus, like maybe a wing, but not a wing I recognized. Big, flat-ish sections like the side of a hangar, then a rounder belly. Size-wise, if that shadow was 200 feet across, I wouldn't have been shocked. It didn't look like a plane. It didn't have navigation lights. I could see the cloud itself roll around it as if it was something the cloud was sliding past. The next lightning strike, slower this time because the whole place was charged, illuminated it again, and I could see the edges clearer, the negative space between cloud and shape. It outlined dimensions that didn't make sense for any man-made craft I'd ever seen. The hair on my arms rose. I had the hot stick in my hand and the clamp under my glove, but there's no training for the way your hands go cotton soft when you look up and see scale wrong. The weird little things started stacking up. The metal on the line turned a faint blue under that light, like everything that touched the shape had been painted with a pale wash. My watch ticked but seemed slow. I remember checking it twice and thinking the second hand lingered on a number longer than it should. The comms came back sporadically, control to County 1 on the scanner, report of multiple grid anomalies, and then again gone. Marco's voice came through once, clipped, "You seeing?" And the line petered to white noise right after. No static. The kind of silence that says the air itself isn't taking the message. It hovered above us for what felt like a long time. The bucket creaked. I could see the creek below where the flash reflected off the water like silver coins. There were no birds. Normally, swallows will slice and duck around the tower no matter the weather. That night, there was nothing. Not a single animal noise. Even the flies up there had stopped. And that's when the size of it settled in. It had this presence that seemed to claim the air below. We kept working. You do, because your job is to restore the feed and keep people safe. I tightened the third clamp, triple-checked ground, and prepared to re-energize when the primary came back. The control center was pinging, and then the breaker clicked on in a way I felt through my chest. A low thump through the line and the world hummed to life around me. The hotline hum normalized, the ceramic squeal changed pitch, and the line's vibration went from this odd steady tone to the clean frequency I know. Power was back on the spur. At the exact moment the breaker closed, whatever that pale thing was slipped. The cloud lighting faded, and in the flash the silhouette thinned and then sheared away like someone unrolled a screen. It left no contrail, no sound, nothing. One lightning bolt later, the sky was a complicated, normal thunderhead again. The radio came alive with voices, and the rain returned full tilt as if something had released an inhalation. After the line was stable, I climbed down. On the ground, Marco swore and half laughed. He said his phone had gone dead in his pocket, and he actually thought the weather had fried it. The little LED voltmeter I keep in the toolbox read all normal. Our DVR out at the substation recorded a minute or two of weird static at the same timestamp we'd lost on the scanner, but nothing physical. No aircraft on radar, no debris found, nothing to point to. The men on the other crews said they'd seen odd flashes on the cloud deck from the other side of the county, like flashbulbs popping in slow motion. Dispatch logged the event as a grid anomaly and filed it under weather-related unexplained. Official speak. Speak. They told the paper a formula about lightning and charged pockets, and nobody wanted to hear a lineman tell them that lightning had backlit something that didn't look like a plane. I drove home slow with the truck lights on low, rain spitting at the windshield in that raw way. It was hard to sleep afterward. Not because I felt haunted, but because my head kept making lists. The odd tone in the line before the breaker, the way the noise died, the exact moment the breaker closed and the thing left. I checked the camera on the barn of the closest farm the next morning. The footage shows a storm, a lot of light, and a period where the audio drops out. No silhouette, no object. The timestamps on the feed line up to the grid logs. There's a 9-second window my camera recorded as plain white snow and nothing else. People want answers, but I don't have one. I don't have a story about lights on or secret aircraft or military tests. I have a night where the job took me up above the noise, where the weather did something I've only seen on nature programs, and where a form the size of a hangar moved through a low cloud, quiet as fog. I have the way my hands felt loose in my gloves when it happened, the steady click of the breaker, and the small, stubborn fact that as soon as the grid came back, the sky changed. Every time I drive past Pole 47 now, I find myself unconsciously looking up at the clouds. Mostly, it's just clouds and weather, the kind of sky you talk about with other linemen. Watch that front, it'll burn east. But sometimes, when there's lightning in the distance, and a low bank hangs fat and patient on the horizon, my gut tightens and I think about that pale shape and how the world went quiet long enough for me to see it. I was about halfway home when the first weird thing happened. It was late August, the kind of dusk that hangs warm on your shoulders even after the sun drops. I'd taken my usual shortcut through the old rail path that cuts between Baker Street and the housing development. You can shave 10 minutes off if you push your bike through the underpass. Headphones off because my mom says don't be stupid at night, and I like the quiet anyway. The crickets, somebody's radio leaking through a window, the occasional dog bark, normal summer evening stuff. The small oddities started slow. There was a light up ahead at the underpass that usually flickered and buzzed, but tonight it was steady, almost too steady, like someone had replaced a bulb with a new one that didn't belong. I thought about it and kept pedaling. Then a car went by on the street above, and its radio shrieked with static for about 3 seconds before settling on a song. That was my next weird thing. The song, cut like a record scratch, came back, and the driver didn't seem to notice. I called out, "You okay?" But the car was already past. By the time I pushed the bike under the bridge, the air felt different, like someone had wrapped the path in cotton. The usual wind that comes down the hollow was gone. My sneakers scuffed a little more than usual on the gravel. I remember thinking, for no good reason, that the hum of the city was thinner than it should be. I reached the clearing where the path opens to the street and paused to check my phone. No messages, battery fine, and then the dog on the corner started barking, like its throat had disconnected from the rest of the world and decided to scream. It went on and then cut out mid-bark, which is a weird sound to hear if you've never heard it before. Not silence exactly, but an abrupt stop. I pushed my bike into the road there because I hate riding through the subdivision. Folks are messy with their sprinklers and kids. That's when I noticed the sky. The stars were starting to come out, not many yet, just the bright ones, but a patch of the heavens above the north end of town looked off, darker, like someone had pulled a sweater over that bit of sky. I squinted, shading my eyes with my hand, and at the same time a low hum started beneath me. Not in my ears at first, but in my chest. The kind of bass you feel at a concert if you stand too close to the speakers. It was steady and flat, a tone that didn't change pitch. I looked up properly then. I don't know why I did, but there it was. A triangular shadow the size of 3 houses, just above the tree line. It blocked the stars in a clean, straight triangle. No lights, no blinking red beacons you get on planes. Just a matte darkness like a cutout placed against the sky. It moved so slow that I thought maybe I was imagining speed. Planes move with engines and stars streak differently. This thing drifted like a page sailing down in slow motion. My first thought was drones. Lots of folks around here mess with drones. But drones make a sound. They hum sharp and close, little frantic rotary notes. This hum was different, long, low, like wind in a pipe, and it didn't come from the thing in the sky so much as from the air between me and it. My throat went dry. I remember that detail because I tried to swallow a few times and felt like the sound swallowed the motion. For a few seconds, I just stood there. The street was empty. The neighbor's porch light swung a little in its chain but didn't flicker. A branch on the maple near the curb hung completely still. Even my bike seemed loud in the silence when I moved the kickstand. Then something else happened that made my stomach take a running leap upward. The humming cut off. Not faded, not a slow dying. It stopped like someone flipped a switch. Everything that had been part of the background snapped back into motion at once. Someone honked 2 blocks over, a kid on a skateboard laughed, a dog started yapping like he remembered how. The triangle was gone. It vanished so cleanly that for a second I thought I'd blinked. One instant there was a heavy dark shape and a pressure that made my ears feel funny. The next, the sky was as it always was at dusk, only with more stars appearing as if someone had suddenly unzipped a velvet curtain. The sense of wrong was still there though. That odd, tight feeling in my chest you get when your brain knows a rule and something broke it. I pedaled the rest of the way slowly. The streetlight seemed a little dimmer, but steady. I checked my phone again, no missed calls, no weird notifications. The GPS timestamp on the screen matched the clock in my head. I got home, shut the garage door, left the bike in the mudroom. My mom asked how practice was. I said fine, made dinner, tried to act normal. She asked what took me so long, and I told her I'd taken the scenic route because my legs felt like pedaling. She laughed and said okay, and we moved on. I didn't tell her at first. There's always this small voice that says, don't tell, because people will roll their eyes and hand you the standard list. Bad pizza, tired eyes, too many late nights. I told my friend Luis an hour later when I texted him a dumb meme. He was quiet for a bit and then wrote back, "You see that triangle too? My cousin called from the highway, said the same." That was the first time the memory unbottled for me and didn't taste totally insane. Luis and I met up the next morning at the diner. He'd been out late too, but had been farther north. Said his headlights picked out a dark shape down near the old mill building. Same slow movement. We both tried not to make too much of it. People trade stories. Memory edits itself. But the two of us comparing details made it feel less like a weird dream. He said his truck radio had gone dead for a minute while the thing passed, which fit with the silence I'd heard fall after the humming stopped. That afternoon, I went back with my bike and a flashlight because I wanted to see if there was anything on the lawn, the road, the gutters, some physical trace of what had been overhead. There was nothing. Grass unpressed, tire tracks only from cars. A smear of tar on the curb looked like the usual, not like anything melted or burned. The only odd thing was a thin film of condensation on the inside of my bike helmet, where I'd left it that morning on the porch. I wiped it and thought that was probably sweat from last night, but the way it felt cold made me mention it to Luis later, and he said his dog had been shaking even though it wasn't cold out. Weeks went by and nothing else big happened, though there were smaller strangenesses. A group of streetlights by the community center blinked in a pattern for 6 seconds one night, and nobody could explain why the control box was fine. The highway cameras recorded an odd shadow passing over the overpass, but with no recognizable edges. The footage was fuzzy in a way the tech people said could be compression. Old Mr. Helper from 3 blocks over swore his barn radio went static at 9:17 p.m. The night I'd seen it, and that his chickens got quiet for a whole minute. I kept riding my bike. You don't stop living because one thing you can't explain brushes your life. But I found myself looking up more, especially when I was near that underpass with the steady light. If I heard a low hum, now it made me tense, fingers tight on the handlebars, waiting for something to cut out or fall apart. The triangle never came back to my part of town, at least not while I was watching. But sometimes I'd catch a flicker on the horizon when the clouds were thin and think I saw a corner of it moving against the stars. People say we live in a world with cameras on every corner, that nothing truly vanishes. That's true enough, but the thing I saw didn't leave a photo, or if it did, the frame collapsed into static. The only evidence I have is my own memory, Luis's, that old farmer's chicken silence. That and the way a normal evening rewired itself for a moment into something else. I told my mom eventually because she noticed I was jumpier, asking if I wanted her to drive me to practice. She listened and then asked if I'd called the sheriff. I said no. What would I say? There was a big dark triangle in the sky and my phone was quiet. She sighed and told me to keep my head down. Her way of saying she worried without making it worse. Night still feels different sometimes. When I'm pedaling down that rail path, I glance up and check the sky. It's probably the same stars as always, but the habit of looking has stuck. If you asked me to explain what I saw, I'd say it was a shape that didn't belong, slower than engines, quieter than wind. I'd say the hum cut out like a curtain closing, and the world went on as if nothing had happened. I don't know what else to say, and I don't have a neat way to finish this off, because there isn't one. I came home that night. I slept. The days kept happening. Sometimes, when the wind dies down and the underpass light is a little too steady, I lock my bike up at the end of the driveway and watch the sky for a while, not expecting anything to return, only knowing I'm looking now in case it does. I was coming back from a late shift at the clinic, driving along County Road 18. It was about 11:40 at night, cool but not cold, and the sky was perfectly clear. Out there, it's all fields and tree lines. No streetlights, no traffic once you're past the feed store. I'd done that drive 100 times, so I wasn't paying much attention. Just me, the hum of the tires, and the faint glow of the dash lights. A little after the turnoff for Miller's Creek, I noticed headlights in my mirror. They were pretty far back at first, 2 steady beams, nothing unusual. It actually made me feel better. There's something about being alone on those roads that can get under your skin. But within a minute or so, the lights caught up, closer than I liked. Like whoever it was didn't feel like backing off. I was in no mood for tailgaters. I kept glancing in the mirror, waiting for them to pass, but they didn't. The lights stayed locked behind me, bright enough that I had to flick the mirror to night mode. That's when I realized something was wrong. The beams weren't hitting the pavement. Usually, you can see the light bouncing off the gravel and catching the dust. But these beams stretched higher, angled upward, like the headlights were pointing straight into the sky. I thought maybe the car had a bad lift kit or busted suspension, but when I looked again, the beams were climbing, stretching past the tree line ahead. I slowed down, half ready to pull over, but the lights didn't slow with me. They didn't pass either. Instead, they kept rising, smooth and steady, like a pair of spotlights lifting into the air. Then they weren't in my rear view anymore. They were above the trees, glowing white and silent. I craned my neck out the window, trying to spot the vehicle, but the road behind me was empty. Nothing. No headlights, No engine noise, no dust cloud, just a clear stretch of gravel fading into darkness. My heart was thumping hard, but not in the way it does when someone cuts you off. It was more like my body knew before I did that I wasn't seeing something normal. The lights drifted higher until they were just points above the tree line, then winked out all at once. The road was dark again, so dark I had to blink a few times to adjust. I kept driving, not fast, just steady, gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to. When I glanced back at the dashboard clock, it read 11:52. That didn't make sense. I just checked it a couple minutes before, right when I'd seen the lights first rise. It should have been 11:43, maybe 11:44 at most. Somehow, 3 minutes were gone. I drove the rest of the way home without the radio, without even rolling the windows down. Every sound, the rattle of gravel, the hum of the tires seemed too loud, like I was the only thing moving in a world that had stopped. When I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, I sat there a long time staring at the clock. It still said 11:52. I was halfway through the last cold beer when Gus stopped mid-chew and stared up. We had the little patio light on and the sprinkler set to the front lawn, the kind of late summer night that makes your skin feel like it's holding on to the day. My wife was at a friend's and I'd promised myself a quiet hour outside before collapsing into bed. Gus, boxer mutt, ridiculous paws, the only dog I've ever known to snore like a tractor, was stretched on his back next to my chair, legs in the air, the way he always was when he was absolutely content. He froze like someone had hit pause on him. His ears went straight up. I tipped my head and followed his line of sight. Above the maple at the end of the yard, the stars looked wrong. Not brighter, not dimmer. Wrong the way a misplaced note sounds in a familiar song. A handful of them were no longer fixed points. They were sliding, slowly together like leaves drifting on a stream. The cluster moved as one, a tidy group, and it crossed the sky as if it had a route it'd practiced. At first I thought it might be satellites. I've watched those slow chains before. Phone constellations, I think, the neighborhood kids used to call them. But these weren't linear. They kept roughly the same distance between each other, like they were keeping formation. And they moved in a curve that was too smooth to be aircraft at that altitude. The motion wasn't quick. It took maybe 3 minutes for the cluster to drift from the maple over toward the old radio tower to the south. When it stopped, the group sat in a new arrangement, one of those small, dumb rearrangements that makes your eye expect something to match, and it doesn't. Gus didn't budge from his belly. He nosed his head under the porch step and wouldn't come out even when I whistled. That was the first real skin prickle moment. My dog, who will fetch a lawn chair for an audience, refusing his own yard. Before the stars started moving, I had noticed a couple of other small wrong things, and I'm the kind of person who notices small wrong things. The radio in the kitchen that sits on the window shelf and plays oldies all the time had given a single thin burst of static that sounded almost like a voice, and then went quiet as if someone had taken the station away. The digital clock over the stove blinked 11:07, then skipped to 11:10 when I went in to get another beer. I told myself it was a power blip or the cheap clock losing its mind, and I left the porch light on for company. Those are the sensible explanations you reach for in the beginning. The dogs in the neighborhood went from their usual evening barks to a kind of high, single note, and then nothing. I noticed that because across the fence, old Mrs. Fenley's terrier, the one that yaps at our cat, usually keeps tenacious hours, and that night he cut off the same second Gus stared. The sounds snapped off like the world had been muted a notch. The breeze that had been moving the maple leaves died out. The night pressed closer, lighter somehow. The stars shone plain. Then that handful of them glided. I tried to get a photo. I've got a decent phone, newer model, and it usually handles night sky pictures better than I do. My thumb fumbled and my screen filled with the little spinning circle of loading for a beat, and then the camera app closed. I opened it again, and the image I took came out like a smear. More like someone had taken Vaseline to the lens than anything actually captured. Same thing when I pointed Gus's little LED collar at the sky. The collar made a weak halo on the porch wood, but did nothing to the moving points above. The stars didn't respond to light. The cluster paused, and then, without looking like they accelerated, the stones in the sky shifted again and rearranged themselves into a line that wasn't a line, and then a compact shape. Not a picture I knew. They settled like someone had set them down with a finger. I felt the urge to stand up and call somebody, because that's what you do when your brain wants proof. But I also felt the opposite urge. To stay perfectly still in the middle of a familiar backyard and watch what your eyes were telling you. My watch, cheap wristwatch, battery a year old, showed 11:14 when the stars began moving, and because I compulsively check it in a night like this, 11:17 when they stopped. I remembered the radio clock skipping earlier, and I told myself the watch was wrong. Later, I checked the microwave, and it said 11:14, and the app on my phone, once it stopped gyrating, agreed. Time felt one of those elastic things for a minute, the way a dream stretches an hour into a second. I didn't black out. I noted the seconds. The stitch was small but visible, like thread that doesn't quite match the rest of the cloth. Neighbors came out, not a lot, just the people who sleep with their windows open or keep their barbecue lights on. A half dozen heads poked from porches along the street, and we did that shapeless communal thing. We squinted up, said, "You seeing this?" and nodded at each other like we were all seeing the same hallucination and willing it into common sense. Nobody seemed afraid enough to call the police. The sort of wrongness that could be filed under weird but not urgent crept up the street. When the cluster stopped, one of the stars wobbled a little and brightened, and for a second I thought it might be a meteor. It steadied though, and the brightness subsided. The new arrangement looked deliberate, like an arrangement someone had designed to be seen but not explained. I thought about how small we are under the sky, and how that fact doesn't change the teeth of the feeling. You can say it's awe, and that's fine and true, but there's something else, a hush that sits over your skin. Gus stayed under the porch. He let me come close and scratch his neck, but when I reached for the leash, he shifted deeper back into shadow and put his big chin on a step and refused. He wuffed softly and wrapped his paws over the top one like he was holding on. I ended up letting the leash drag behind a shoe because I couldn't make him stand. He trembled once and then was still again. He looked at me like he was deciding whether or not to trust his person. I decided to go next door and ask Mrs. Fenley if she'd seen anything. On the walk over there, the streetlights blinked in a pattern, one small blink every 3 seconds, then steady. The light pattern made me think of an old theater sign. She opened her door and let me stand in the porch light, the kind of solid lamp that made everyone's faces too white, and when I asked if she'd seen it, she nodded, slow. "They were moving," she said. "Not like anything I recall. My Harold," she tapped her chest where she keeps his wedding ring in a pocket. "He called it a dance, said not to worry." She paused, like she'd reconsidered something unsaid, and then added, "But Rufus wouldn't go out to pee all night. Wouldn't even look at the yard." Her terrier was, she said, trembling in a corner behind the fern. I told her Gus was on my porch, and she seemed to think that made sense, as if animals were tuned into a channel we barely hear. We went back to our yards. The cluster had rearranged again into a pattern I didn't have words for, like a constellation someone had redrafted for a different sky. My phone on the kitchen counter finally got a text from my sister. "You outside? My feed is wild." And when I opened it, there were a handful of clip messages from other friends saying they'd been watching too. Not everyone had seen them. Not everyone wanted to talk about it. The ones who did used a lot of the same phrasing, like a handful moved together. The dogs went funny. I tried to get more pictures. The second attempt, the camera app behaved like it had something loaded. It didn't want to show me. A buffer loop of black frames and one where a pale smear crossed the image and then the file corrupted. I uploaded the corrupted file to a cloud thing on autopilot and the upload failed. It was small, inconvenient technology failing, but it always feels like proof's the first thing to go when the world flexes. By midnight, the neighbors had drifted back indoors. Lights turned off one by one. Music behind windows started up again. The street resumed its quiet, the air a little cooler than before. Gus stayed under the porch. I brought him a blanket from inside and set it down near his head. He let me lay it and then folded himself deeper into the shadow. I sat for a long time after that, not sure whether I was waiting for anything or hoping nothing else would happen. The cluster eventually dispersed. The stars returned to their regular, gorgeous, stubborn points. The night did what nights always do. It let you think there's continuity again. Gus didn't move until dawn. He did come back into the house when Jenna's alarm went off next morning. She came over after my wife told her I'd seen something strange, and he trotted in like nothing was wrong. He slept nearly all day the way dogs do after a long night. I did what people do in these situations. I told the story in pieces to Mrs. Fenley, to Jenna, to a coworker who raised his eyes and said, "Huh, weird," and then to my wife when she came home that afternoon. We walked the yard at dusk the next night, us all looking up, and nothing repeated. The maple's leaves turned, the streetlights hummed in their usual way, and the sprinklers kept to their schedule. There's no tidy ending. Gus will sleep on the porch sometimes now when the evening smells like rain, but he never stretches fully out under the stars like he used to. He keeps one eye open, and if I glance up at the sky and see a pattern that's just slightly off, one that might be a plane, or might be a group of satellites, or might be nothing, my first instinct is to hunch my shoulders and call him in. The memory of the stars moving stays like a small ache in the back of my throat, easy to ignore until something else nudges it. I make coffee in the mornings, check the clocks, and go to work. Life holds its edges in place. The dog lies under the porch and watches, and that feels like reason enough to look up. I finished charting the last med and pushed my chair back from the workstation because my legs were gone. It was the kind of night where everything felt slow. The third consecutive night shift, and a sky that had been leaking drizzle on and off for hours. My name's Elena. I've been a nurse on nights at St. Mary's for 6 years. The parking lot light by the front entrance hummed like an old refrigerator, and the night clerk was already in his cot in the security office, headphones on, so I grabbed my bag and headed out. Small things were off before I even left the unit. The telemetry monitors had been quiet for hours, usually at least 2 people beeping somewhere, but the boards were oddly blank, like everyone had been discharged at once. The oxygen wall gauges in room 12 cycled in a softer rhythm than usual, and when I checked the clock on the med cart, it had for a good 10 seconds before catching up. I made a joke to Luis at the desk, "Ghost shift, huh?" And he gave me that tired half smile and said, "Weird night." He didn't laugh. That's how nights start to pile up, a few things you can shrug off and a couple that don't fit together. On the way out, I passed the chapel door. The light above it was on, even though it's usually off at night. It threw a rectangle of warm yellow over the wet pavement. Someone had left a pair of shoes outside, neat by the step, like a person had walked out barefoot and never come back. I thought about asking security, but the guard's window was dark and empty. The automatic doors sighed and closed behind me, and I walked past the ambulance bay where the crew was finishing a cigarette. "Long night?" I asked. They shrugged. One of them squinted at the sky and said, "Storm's weird," then walked away like he didn't want to talk about it. I always park at the far end of staff lot because it's quieter. My car is an old Subaru with a coat of salt and a dent in the rear bumper that I keep promising to fix. As I crossed the row of cars, the lights from the building threw long bars across the asphalt. There was a stray patient information leaflet caught under a windshield wiper, flapping slowly. I stopped to pick it up and fold it, habit more than kindness, when every car alarm in the lot all at once erupted. It was the strangest cacophony I've ever heard. Metallic, thin, like someone had turned on a dozen tiny sirens. They didn't sound angry, not like alarms when someone's trying to break in. They sounded almost coordinated, a single note bouncing between vehicles like a ripple. I had the leaflet in my hands, and I remember my lungs emptying because the noise came on so sudden. People in scrubs looked up from half-sheltered benches. An orderly stepped out from behind the triage doors, and a security camera on the roof of the ER feed wobbled in its mount like a head turning. I froze under the fluorescent spill and watched the lot through the glass of the hospital's east wing. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the windows, as clear as if it were a literal thing in the air, a silver oval was drifting over the building. It was low, low enough that its underside, whatever underside meant for it, blocked a block of the sodium halo from the parking lot lights. The shape wasn't sharp-edged, more like a slab of metal wrapped in satin. It moved slow, deliberately, and the reflection made it look like it was walking across the sky right above the roofline. Even then, my brain kept offering safe explanations. Balloon, a blimp, a police drone, but the oval didn't have any lights, not the steady red or blinking greens you expect. No strobes, no beam. It made no sound, no thrum or distant wind. The lot alarms kept squealing in that same single pitch, and the world felt like a film running just a hair too fast or too slow. I watched the thing in the glass, and half of me was thinking to pull out my phone. The other half kept me rooted to the spot. My hands felt damp, and I realized I hadn't noticed until then that the coat I had on was soaked through at the shoulders, the drizzle more of a mist now. By the time I found the courage to look up, not at the reflection, at the real sky above the building, there was nothing. Empty clouds, the usual halo of sodium and moonlight. I blinked, and something like a pause in my chest eased. The car alarms cut off at the same breathless instant the oval vanished from the glass. No one clapped, no one cheered. People just stared at the paper in their hands or at the asphalt where spray was beading in little silver menace. A security guard came out then, flashlight tracing and collar up against the mist. His radio clicked and hissed but carried no one else's voice. He looked at me, eyebrows up, and I told him what I had seen, the reflection. He squinted up, then at the patrol car, then back at the night sky, and said, "You and me both," as if that meant anything at all. He told me the alarms had all gone off in an exact sequence and then shut off again, and that watch cams picked up the noise, but nothing in the frames but white smear for a second. He hesitated and then added, and the timestamp jumped on the feed, 9 minutes covered in static. He wasn't the kind of guy to make stories. He was the guy who counted cigarettes and kept a tidy desk. I heard the tightness in his voice, and I realized I was carrying the same thing. I pressed my forehead briefly to my steering wheel before getting in. My hands shook enough that they slid across the rim when I started the engine. The heater coughed, then warmed, and outside the windshield, the world went back to ordinary. Wet asphalt, a couple of patients huddled under a bus shelter, a couple of headlights moving away down the access road. I told myself, out loud, that I was tired and on edge. That made sense. That's the kind of sentence you give yourself when you want to believe the regular world is still the regular world. The drive home is normally a half hour of static and nothing, radio turned low, coffee cup cooling in the cup holder. That night, the radio cut out again around the county line for a full 10 miles, just dead air, and then came back like a train pulling into a station. The street signs looked wrong for a few minutes. Anytime I blinked, they seemed to be one word off, or the fonts thicker. My calendar notification dinged and told me it was 3:17 a.m. when my phone had said 3:08 at the hospital. I thought about the security feed timestamp and the guard's static report, and I told myself I was making patterns out of noise. When I pulled into my driveway, the house lights gave me a small domestic comfort. My cat, Miso, met me at the door with an accusation of cold paws and a tail curved like a question mark. I left my wet coat in a heap on the foyer chair and made coffee because it's what I always do, and because the motions of making it, measuring grounds, the metallic scrape, the whir of the kettle, feel like assembling the pieces of a life back into place. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with a mug and the window open a crack and kept watching the sky. I told myself I would go back in the morning and ask someone if they'd seen anything. I thought about calling my sister, but the story sounds thin when you say it out loud. A reflection and alarms and a thing that wasn't there when you turned. People give you a half-sympathetic laugh. You need rest, and that's a polite end to a strange night. At some point between news reports and the kettle's second refilling, I checked my watch again. It was 3 minutes ahead of the phone. I set them both down and left them there, not sure which one to trust. The world had a seam in it somewhere, like a pattern that got knit twice over in a place and made a ridge under your fingers. The coffee grew cold. Miso slept in the curled fist of my palm. Dawn came wrong and kind of soft, pink in the east through the clouds. I drove back to work at 7 because I always do, and the lot looked ordinary in daytime. Damp, quiet, the cars parked where they always were. The security guard from the night shift had taken a longer break and was back to rolling his wheelbarrow of cones. He greeted me like the world had been stitched back. I said nothing about the timestamp. I keep replaying the image that stopped me that night. The silver oval in the hospital windows, so clear and present in the glass, like something someone had decided to project because the night needed a center of attention. The sensible parts of me make lists. Reflections, refractions, a billboard light, my mind running off shift work. Those explanations sit in the mind like shoeboxes for receipts. But the rest of it, how every car in the lot shouted together and how everything settled the exact moment whatever it was left the roofline, doesn't quite fit into a box. I went home that morning and did laundry, and later that day, I checked the security footage at the nurse's station out of habit, because we all do that now when something odd happens. The clip around 308 shows the lot, an empty rectangle of rain-slick asphalt, a smear of white where something clipped the camera for a fraction of a second, then silence. No shape, no craft. The timestamps are smudged for 9 minutes like ink left out in the rain. The footage doesn't answer anything. It kind of refuses to be useful. If you ask me what I think it was, I'd tell you I don't know. I know I walked past the chapel. I know the shoes were still there, dry now in the morning sun. I know the alarms went off, and the whole parking lot made a single metallic noise and then stopped. I know the reflection in the glass showed something silver drifting above the roof, and when I turned around, the sky didn't have it. I know I drove home and made coffee and watched the sky until dawn. I am here. I came home. I am writing this between shifts, and I look up when I pass the hospital at night now. I don't expect it to return. I just look because I can, and because sometimes the world hands you a thing that won't fold neatly back into normal, and the only honest thing to do is watch for it. The ground under my sleeping pad started to hum before anything else did. I woke because the vibration was insistent enough to move my elbow in the tent. It wasn't the soft, regular weight of a passing truck on the distant forest road. This was thin and steady, like a bass note pressed into earth. I lay there for a second, thinking it was a rainstorm or my imagination, then unzipped the flap and peered out. The treetops were leaning the same way. Not a breeze, not a gust, not that random rustle you get when a squirrel runs along a branch. Every crown on the ridge across the creek angled in the same direction and held. The leaves didn't shimmer. They held that tilt like someone had tilted the whole forest to one side. My headlamp beam skimmed the pine needles, and they didn't move except to reflect the light back. Above them, a long, pale glow was sliding across the sky. It wasn't a dot or a flash. It was a soft, stretched light, maybe the shape of a canoe if a canoe were blown up and lit from inside. It moved slow, in one clean glide without edges, more a suggestion of something than a form. Silent. No rumble, no wing wash, nothing. The reflection of it made the creek look like it was breathing white under the dark. The ground under my pad vibrated in time with that light, a faint pulse through the soil that sounded like a far-off train if you put your ear to the rail. My name's Nate. I'd hiked up into the Laurel Hollow area for 2 nights by myself. No signal, no one at the parking lot, the sort of trip you take to get a clean head. I'd set the tent on a small bench near a tributary because it was flat and I liked the sound of the water. I knew the route. Creek, switchback, the ridge, then down to where the old logging road flattened. I'd locked the car, walked in at dusk, saw 1 or 2 other headlamps far off on a different spur. Nothing out of the ordinary until a dozen small things that are easy to ignore stacked in a row and made a pattern. Before I set up, there had been the deer. I cut across a meadow and 5 of them froze in the brush like cutouts. Not running, not startled, just statues with their heads turned the same direction. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds while my heart did that slow thud thing, and then one blinked and they melted into the trees, and that was that. I chalked it up to the way deer are. Then there was the headlamp I passed on the way in. I heard the rustle at the shelter ridge, and the beam swung once and died like someone had dropped their batteries. I called out and got nothing back. Later that night, I walked by the same spot and the lamp was gone. No footprint, no drop pack, nothing. When I reached camp, I found my small compass lying in the tent vestibule with the needle dancing like a drunk. Not a slow wobble, full spins 10 degrees back, then another snap. I'd had that compass since college. It wasn't fragile. I blamed it on the magnet in the stove lid, but the stove was in the bag and the bag had been zipped when I left. It calmed eventually, but I remembered it because it felt like the world was making small exceptions to its own rules. The stream that night was louder than I expected, but sound was doing weird things everywhere. Some of the owls were quiet, and the frogs stopped altogether at 11 when I looked at my watch. I assumed a cold front had moved in. The clouds had been thick earlier, broken now into a dark river of sky, low like someone had folded the heavens. The weather app on my phone didn't load. I didn't expect it to, but the barometer on my little handheld read steady, which made the sudden silence all the more notable. The glow kept sliding. It moved just outside the tree line, following the ridge. It didn't blink, it didn't sharpen, just flowed like a slow tide. The breath in my chest kept catching because everything else that normally says, "This is fine," the leaves, the insects, the damn creek, had become an audience frozen in a theater. I unzipped the tent all the way and crawled out in my socks. The dirt underfoot was cool, and when I crouched down, I could feel the vibration clearer. It wasn't like a single thump. It was a steady, double-tap pulse that ran along the root lines and made the grass hum. My phone screen stayed black when I tapped it. No camera, no map, nothing. No bars, which is normal up there, but it felt wrong to be so cut off with something like that overhead. I made a stupid decision. I grabbed the little binoculars from the pack. Up close, the glow didn't show structure. You couldn't tell if it was something big far away or something thin and close. The edges were soft, and it moved as if it were being pulled on a string with a gardener's patience. When I held the lenses steady, my breath fogged the glass, and for a second, a smear of my own breathing covered half the view, and I saw nothing but the smear, and then the glow was gone, swallowed by the night. The treetops dropped back, and the undergrowth started making their normal sounds, a cautious return like fingers unclenching. That loss, both the suddenness of the vanishing and the way my watch seemed to read a time that didn't match what I remembered, was what stayed with me most. I checked the watch because I always do. It read 1:04 a.m. I blinked and thought, no, I'd sat up earlier at midnight for a second, had looked at it, and it said 12:46. When I checked again, my watch slid calmly to 1:05, as if nothing odd had happened. Time felt elastic in that moment, like a rubber band pulled then let go. I didn't start hiking out until first light, partly because I wanted daylight to make me braver, and partly because I thought maybe I dreamt it. The route down felt normal at first. The creek, the rooty switchbacks, the blazes on the oaks, but the forest kept giving me small signs that something had been there. My trail marker tape, bright orange, was gone from a spot I'd tied one to for later sighting, and in its place the bark had a narrow scratch like a fingernail across a ledger. I found another marker a quarter-mile on, lodged in the crotch of a sapling, folded around like someone had retied it and left. No footprints, no trash, just those odd, precise little rearrangements. I met one other person coming up as I was heading out, an older woman with a day pack and a dog. She waved and said good morning like we do in places where people know each other's faces. "You camping?" she asked. I'll tell you how I answered. I shrugged and said yeah. Just a quick overnight. She didn't press. Later, she told a story to whoever would listen about lights she'd seen years ago and how animals react, and I thought about stopping her to ask if she'd noticed anything the night before, but I didn't. There's a way people tell certain things. They look at you with the expectation you'll nod, and then they move on. Maybe she'd seen this once and filed it under anomalies. The descent back to the car took longer than it should have. Somewhere on the old logging bridge, I had to stop because both my knees felt like they'd been pinged by a bolt of cold. The air tasted different, like it had been filtered, and my chest kept fluttering in a way that made me check my pulse a stupid number of times. The radio in the parking lot. the one on my friend's truck that I used to check the weather, was static when I flicked it on. I sat for a few minutes just watching for other cars. By the time I drove out of the forest and onto the paved county road, it was nearly noon. The sun had burned off the low cloud in bands, and the sky looked ordinary. I remember glancing at the tree line from the car window, and the pines looked smaller somehow, as if the night had inflated them, then deflated them. I texted my sister when I hit a signal island up on the highway, told her I was coming home a day early. Her reply was what you expect. Good, bring coffee. I almost called her and said, don't go into the Laurel Hollow if you can avoid it. But I didn't. How do you put the words together without sounding like a half-formed thing? Driving home, the funny aftermath set in. A kind of alert curiosity that kept me aware of every passing shadow and streetlight. At a gas station, I checked the footage on a dash cam, and there was nothing but my truck, the timestamp, and then a short blank white frame that appeared at the exact period when the glow had passed. The clerk shrugged when I asked, said his camera sometimes hiccuped. He didn't spend the kind of money to look for the hiccup. I didn't push. That night, in my apartment, I lay awake until 2 a.m., lights off, listening for the hum that had once run under me. There was nothing but the building's machinery. The elevator, a pipe clanging occasionally when someone above took a shower. The planets were clear in the window. I thought about going back the next weekend with someone, a friend who knows how to handle the dark, but the idea of the routine of a second trip felt wrong, as if by replaying it I'd break something sealed. I told 2 friends about it in the week after, one that I go hiking with a lot and one who's obsessed with weather anomalies. They both had soft ways of deflecting. Maybe it was lenticular clouds. Maybe you were really tired. The weather friend said the treetops could look like that with certain microbursts, and the watch could be a glitch. I didn't say the binoculars showed nothing when the glass fogged. I didn't say the vibration was like a note under the ground. I left out how the river looked when that light's reflection passed, like something had smoothed its skin and then gone. Weeks pass, and you tuck things away. You unpack the moment, fold it into your usual narrative like a stray receipt in a wallet. But the habit stuck. I look up at the sky more than I used to. Sometimes at the edge of night, I will stand on my balcony and watch cloud banks crawl and wait, stupidly, as if I've trained my eye to a cue. Most of the time, there's nothing but light pollution and the drone of traffic. I went back to Laurel Hollow last month during the day, walked the ridge, checked the trees. The orange marker tapes I'd hung were where I'd left them. The old logging bridge had a new plank. Someone had been there. The scratch on the bark is still there, thin and pale, like a scar on a hand. I run my thumb over it and it feels ordinary, just healed wood. No one I spoke with had at that moment seen anything odd. They'd heard the usual stories about lights over the county, not one specific recollection, just a sense that the place carriers old events. So that's it. I went up for a night, something odd crawled the sky, and the forest behaved like an audience that forgot how to breathe. I came home. I sleep in a bed that doesn't hum under it. I make coffee in the morning and drive to work and pay attention to small things that used to drift by me. I don't have a tidy explanation. I don't have footage anyone reliable would accept. I have the memory of treetops leaning together and a pale, long light sliding silent across clouds while the ground under my tent pulsed like a bass note. That memory lives with the rest of the things you try to shrug off but find yourself checking for anyway, the way something that shouldn't happen did, and how everything resumed as if some rule had been paused and then resumed, leaving a space in your day where it had been. We'd been laughing about something dumb. Eli had just dropped his lantern and it rolled into a tide pool, and Marco was narrating the slow-motion rescue like it was an epic, when the water did the thing that made everyone go quiet. My name's Hannah. We drove down from the city for a long weekend, 5 of us. Me, Jenna, Marco, Eli, and Sarah. We picked the cove because it was one of those places no one checks, a narrow ribbon of sand between a headland and a blackened reef. An old state park that closes off after dusk. We set up camp in the high sand, a couple of tents, a cooler, speakers low, the smell of charcoal and seaweed. It was late July. warm, the sort of heat that makes the air sit on your skin. The tide had been doing its normal thing all afternoon, coming in, then going back, until sundown when it seemed to hesitate a beat and then retreat more than any of us expected. At first, I thought someone had spooked the seals. Out on the flats, a line of gulls had flown up and then banked hard like a string pulled taut, heading toward the far shore. Their cries were sharp and quick, not the lazy calls you hear when they're bored. Marco said, "Maybe an otter." And Eli laughed until his laugh died because the gulls didn't go back. Instead, they circled higher and then disappeared into the evening like they'd been called. We weren't alone in noticing small wrong things that night. The radio in my truck, old thing, FM only, had gone dead the minute the sun sank. Not crackle, not fade, just a flat silence. Marco fiddled with it, tapping the dash, flipping knobs. When it came back an hour later, it landed on a weather band playing a man talking about a storm 3 counties over and then cut off again. Phones were spotty. Jenna's kept saying no service even though she'd been checking messages earlier in the day. Anyway, we built the fire and told stories. There was a low hum under the surf, normal when the swell lines up against the reef, but then the hum took a low, insistent tone that felt wrong. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure that hung against your chest. I noticed everyone leaning a little forward, as if waiting. The beach felt smaller, like the headland had moved a little closer. Eli walked the wet sand on a dare, stamping the shells like he owned them. He came back holding a small starfish under his flashlight, face lit like a kid with a prize. He said the water felt cold like a fridge around his ankles, though the air was hot. We all shrugged that off. Salt and river runoff can make ridiculous temperature differences, and went back to swatting mosquitoes and drinking warm beer. A couple of hours later, Sarah's flashlight beam flicked out. Not the LED flicker you can fix with new batteries, but a definite and stubborn fade. She swapped it with mine. I clicked on the spare, and it gave a thin, ghostly glow, hardly enough to read by, like someone had turned the dimmer down on normal. We joked about apocalypse batteries until Jenna went quiet and pointed. The water had pulled back. I'd walked the beach plenty of times and knew where the line should sit at low tide. Halfway to the rocks, a smear of glistening sand with the occasional tide pool. That night, the uncovered sand stretched out like a runway, black and wet and lined with every sort of shell and wrack, kelp, eelgrass, a scattering of crabs left with their bellies up. The exposed reef looked sudden and wrong, like a floor being pulled from under a room. In the distance, a fishing boat we'd seen earlier that afternoon was sitting upright, hull touching mud, engines silent. We all went forward at a cautious trot, the 5 of us forming a loose file. The sound changed as we reached the edge. The surf had gone thin, more of a sigh than a roll, and the rhythm of the waves had stretched longer, like someone slowing a video. It's hard to explain until you're trying to put your hand through it and the motion resists. I felt the sand shift under my boots in a way that made me think of someone pulling a rug. Then we saw the light. It was out on the exposed sand, maybe the size of a car or smaller, dim, not an outright glare. Think of a fog light sliding just above the surface, but cooler, with a pale blue not quite like anything in our headlamps. It hovered maybe a foot or 2 above the sand, and its reflection, if you can call that dark pool a mirror, was a trembling smear that stuttered with each little ripple the breeze could manage. The light didn't roll with the tide. It hung in place. Eli stopped dead and said, "That's not a headlamp." He sounded like a man who'd caught himself saying something he shouldn't. Sarah had her phone out, aiming to capture it, but before she could hit record, the screen went black. Jenna's hands were shaking. She kept saying, "Look at the crabs," like she needed to point at anything to ground herself. We walked toward it slowly. There was an odd hush with the sound. The gulls were silent, not circling anymore, just gone. No waves chattering on the sand. The world had this soft edge where normal noise would be. Even the fire behind us felt anticlimactic. You could hear it, but it was like someone turned the volume down on reality to see if we noticed. When we were about 100 feet away, the sand under my boots was still wet but firm. The dim light didn't get brighter, it just stayed. Marco, who's got a kind of practical calm and has been kayaking since he was a kid, said, almost under his breath, "It's not a buoy." We all took that as a small point of sanity. We were naming the things that it wasn't, which helped for a minute. A crab scuttled near the glow and then froze, antennae out like little question marks. It didn't die. It just stopped, as if whatever had been animating it was paused. Then the water came back. It wasn't a slow creep. The ocean rolled in like a curtain being snapped shut. 1 second, we had a horizon line stretching out forever. The next, the tide was slapping at the exposed reef, climbing over ridges in a way that looked faster than any ebb usually moves. The light winked at the exact instant the first black water hit the flat and was gone. There was no sound to mark the vanishing, just a gap where the glowing thing had been, and our phones scrambling to find bars. The boat that had been grounded slowly lifted, as if someone had put it back on a plinth. Crabs scrambled for the water like people chasing a running bus. The gulls came back in a scatter, calling as if nothing had happened. The air pressure seemed to change. My ears popped as if coming down out of a plane, and the low hum we'd felt earlier eased like fingers off a drum. For a good 10 minutes, we all stood there with the water washing our shoes and the tide pulling our pant legs darker, saying variations of, "Did you see that?" and "What was that?" None of us had answers. Jenna kept looping the same thought. It pulled back too far. It wasn't normal. Eli kept rubbing his arms and said, "My watch jumped forward." He smiled weirdly when he said it, like a bad joke. He checked the cheap digital watch on his wrist, and it read 1:22 when he swore it had said 1:07 a few minutes before. My phone had the same gap when I checked later. The timestamp on a photo I'd taken of the exposed reef said 1:05, but when I compared it to Eli's watch and the file info, the math didn't line up. We all laughed weakly, then, because what else do you laugh about in moments you can't explain? We packed up faster than any of us planned to. The fire was smoldering, and the coals hissed in a small, normal sound. Nobody wanted to leave the beach, not that night. Camping is supposed to be slow. But the air felt thin, and the jokes dried like old bread. We took turns watching the horizon as if the light might return. It didn't. The cove looked the same as it ever did. Black, wet sand, water moving up and down, stars catching in pools. But something in how the night had rearranged itself was sticky. It didn't want to let go of our thoughts. On the drive back over the causeway, phones found something of a signal and a flood of texts came through. People asking about power outages half a town away. A neighbor's tree had fallen on the road earlier that night, and then the call about seals in the inlet. And a vague police alert about a marine anomaly that listed nothing more. We compared what we had, the faint light, the pulled back tide, the time skips. Everyone in the car had a different detail. Marco swore the smashed shells were all clustered like someone placed them. Sarah said the boat had no one on board when it sat on the mud. Jenna insisted the barnacle beds looked cleanly scraped. Little things that might be imagination or might be notes a mind writes because it is making a map of a place it can't understand. We got home at dawn, the city lights like yawning eyes. I slept a little. I checked the news later and found a Twitter thread from a local fisherman who said the tide had run back further than memory, and a police update that called the evening unusual but had no footage to go with it. People threw out words like sensor error and current anomaly. They were trying to make it ordinary. In the weeks since, I keep thinking about the light. Not bright like a UFO in the movies, not a flash of engines or a mechanical shape, just a dim, patient presence over stripped sand. I think about the way an entire beach went quiet, how the ocean answered whatever pinged the world and then restored itself as if nothing had happened. I think about our watches and cameras not lining up, about how we like to keep track of time and how sometimes it slips. I don't have a tidy ending. We came home. We told our friends. The tide returned to its old schedule the next day, and the park ranger who runs the area shrugged and said the coastal sensors had shown a pressure drop and then normal readings. The boat was towed in the morning. No one's gear left aboard. Life moved back into ordinary grooves. Work, bills, coffee. But often, when I hear a gull at dawn or a distant motorboat, I feel that tiny hollow where something else had been. I don't know that I want an answer. I only know that the ocean could do something I have no name for, and for one late night stretch of black sand, the world folded open and let something strange look in. I pulled into the cul-de-sac with a load of boxes still in the back and my scanner buzzing the route for the last stop. It was late November and a wet fog had been hanging all evening, making the streetlights halo like old coins. I'd been making the evening runs for 3 months now. Insulin kits, a pizza place, some habit of the month boxes for the same handful of people, and this small, tidy circle of houses was always the end of my night. Maybe 7 cars were parked, driveways empty. I killed the engine to avoid waking anyone and grabbed the cart. The fog felt close enough to touch, the kind that beads on your jacket and makes your glasses smear. I stepped off the curb and the first little wrong thing happened. The dog in the crane's yard, the one that barks at my truck every time I back in, stopped mid-growl. It didn't trail off. It cut out like someone turned a switch. Silence ate the sound the second the cart wheels hit the asphalt. I told myself it was a coincidence. Dogs do that. But the porch light at the cranes blinked once right then, and the Johnsons across the circle blinked in the same beat. I kept walking, a box under each arm, and watched the pattern play out. Porch lights on every house in the cul-de-sac. Crane, Johnson, Rivera, the small one with the crooked railing, flickering as if they were all tied to the same timer, and some hand was pawing at the knob. My scanner gave a little chirp. I felt my pocket and then went soft. I hit the power button and the screen came back, but the map had jumped forward by 5 street names and then reset. GPS sometimes shivered on me when the fog gets heavy, so I tamped it down as a tech glitch, pushed the cart and rang the first door. Mrs. Rivera answered with her robe wrapped tight. She squinted at me like she does whenever I come in with a package and say, "Evening." I handed over the box and she tucked it in like she always does. The porch light behind her blinked twice in rhythm with the others. She didn't notice. I didn't want to bring up the blinking. You get a lot of looks in this job. I moved to the next house, the little wrong things stacked up. The street lamp near the circle that usually hums had a clean, brittle note when I touched the metal post, and the metal felt warmer than it should in damp air, like a radiator instead of a light pole. My phone, which usually has at least a bar here, registered no service for a stretch. I clicked the home button, checked the time. The dash clock in the van said 9:43. My watch, the cheap digital kind I keep under my sleeve, read 9:43 too. Everything lined up right there. When I was 3 doors from the end, I stopped because all the porch lights pitched into a single small rhythm, off, on, off, like a message in a slow code. The motion was so coordinated it looked choreographed, as if a single hand were skimming them all. I swear I felt the hair on my neck lift, and I'm not a superstitious guy. I just feel patterns, and then I notice them. There was a faint glow that had been collecting in the sky, a seam of light against the low cloud deck, and at first I thought it was the sodium glow from the highway bending weirdly through the fog. Then it moved. Not fast. It slid behind the clouds like the underside of something luminescent was gliding along a hidden track. It kept a wrong kind of silence. No motors, no whoosh, no leaves to give it away. The fog above the cul-de-sac seemed to thin where it passed, like someone had brushed a finger and left a smudge. I looked up and the small group of porch lights blinked in the same rhythm as before, but now they seemed to be answering that slow, sliding glow. The hair on my arms prickled. I reached for my phone again. The screen stuttered, and then a little triangle in the corner flashed, no bars, then steadied. I fumbled the device. When I swiped to the camera, the screen froze for a second with a greenish smear. Then it worked. I pointed it at the seam, and the phone took a picture that showed only an even smear of grain and light. Pixels. Nothing I could hand anyone and say, "Look." I turned my head back to the houses, because the blinking had a cadence that felt like it would resolve if you watched. Houses are lamps and shades and people's routines. They were supposed to be ordinary. I expected to see movement outside a window, a neighbor pulling a curtain, a porch light that didn't want to cooperate. Instead, the lights were steady, no more rhythm. They sat normal, bulbs humming their steady glow as if some time had passed where the whole cul-de-sac had been paused, and then, snap, returned. That snap did something to me. It dropped a note of absurd relief into my chest. I shouldered the box and pushed towards the last house like a man on autopilot, the fog clinging to my collar. The driveway was wet, and my boots left prints that filled with bead-like water. At the door, the bell chimed thin, and Mrs. Crane's voice called out for me to leave it on the step. I set the box down, and she came out carrying a towel to wipe her hands. She smiled and thanked me like any night. I walked back to the van, muscles loose as cloth. On the way, another small wrong thing happened. The wind died entirely. That might not sound like much until you live in a place where the wind keeps the low fog moving. It fell away so complete that a loose tarp on a neighbor's trash can stopped flapping mid-ripple. Sound pooled. The world folded into a narrow pocket of quiet that made the pavement seem too loud. My own footsteps sounded like someone miming them out. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, idling, not wanting to look up and risk seeing the seam again. I wanted the instruments to lie. The scanner chirped back to life on the third try, and the map snapped to my route like nothing had happened. I told myself to load the cart back in, finish the route, be done, get home. Rational talk to anchor a moment that had gone sideways. I drove off the circle slow, lights on low, fog whitening the edges of the headlights, and I kept checking the rear view. I never saw the seam again. The sky looked like the normal, heavy cloud cover of late fall. The porch lights stayed steady as I passed. My watch read 9:57 when I rolled through the stop sign. My phone pinged a late text from dispatch a minute later, asking why I was running 17 minutes behind. At home, I unloaded the van, stacked the empty boxes, and boiled water. Habit sends a lot of men to the kettle after an odd night. The kettle clicked and went through its usual motions. I kept glancing at the window and upstairs at the clock, testing time like a wound. The kettle sang. The wall clock ticked steady. The world reassembled itself into the shape I trusted. All night, I kept checking the street outside with breeds of vigilance I didn't recognize. I lay awake longer than I should have and listened. The fog thinned toward morning. My phone finally caught a bar and filled with texts asking if anyone else had routers glitch, whether our neighborhood had been in the news, if I'd seen any unusual lights. I answered with half sentences. Work was the next day, and the morning felt ordinary in a way that felt false. The route had new trash bags at the end of each driveway like a normal week. Mrs. Rivera waved when I passed the house with her dog trotting at her heel, tail sweeping like it had done for years. I mentioned the blinking to Marco at the depot like I do with small anomalies, the broken scanner, the weird dog behavior, and he gave his typical shrug and said, "Probably a power hiccup. Lines are old around there." But the seam had moved. It had left its mark in the way the lights had answered, and in the small scrapes of time that didn't add up in my head. When I passed that cul-de-sac again the following week, the same neat circle of houses looked exactly the way circles of houses always looked. Kids left a bike on the curb, and some teenager had scrawled something on the mailbox with a Sharpie. The fog was absent that day. The sky cut clean. I've told a couple of friends, and they nod and make jokes about downtown drones and holiday light installers. I haven't posted pictures. The ones I did take are nothing but grain and cheap smear. The scanner log had a gap that tech couldn't explain cleanly. Just a footnote. Signal loss. Dispatch chalked it up to weather interference and moved on. I don't know if I would be telling you this if the dog hadn't quit barking or if every porch light hadn't answered in time. Maybe it would have sat in the file of odd single things you forget. But the way it pulled at a pattern, sound stopping, lights answering, the seam sliding, made me notice how thin the membrane is between the normal and whatever sits just past it. I went home that night. I made the tea. I stacked the empty boxes in the garage. I did all the things that tell a body everything is still as it was. Sometimes, if I get out late now and the fog's right, I slow my van at the end of that cul-de-sac and sit for a minute. The street is quiet and the porch lights are steady. The fog will sometimes crease the clouds toward the west, and I find myself reflexively scanning the seam between streetlight and cloud just to see if what slid there will drift again. It hasn't. The world keeps its shape. I keep my watch set to the van's dash clock. The dog still barks sometimes, but it looks at the sky a little longer than it used to, and that is enough to make me look up too. I was on the balcony having a cigarette because it was one of those nights my apartment felt too small with the TV off. The city was soft, distant horns, an ambulance wafting by 2 blocks away, half the streetlights humming like old refrigerators. I'd been watching the office tower across from mine for a while, the big glass one on 7th and H that lights up like a mini skyline. People work there in shifts. You get used to the slow pulse of lights moving up and down its face as cleaning crews and late programmers go home. Little things had been off all evening, though I didn't really register them at first. The elevator in my building stuck between floors for 20 minutes earlier, and the neighbor knocked on the shaft door forgetting where he was. He swore it was a tech problem. Carlos, the super, came out later with a flashlight and some shrugging. The bodega on the corner played the same 2 songs on loop for an hour and then went completely silent for 10 minutes. My phone gave me a brazen no service alert 3 separate times, and when I finally got signal, there were half a dozen texts asking if anyone else's clocks had jumped. I figured some transformer had a hiccup. City living has a lot of hiccups. The tower across the street had this company logo up near the top, neon, white. It's supposed to go dim after midnight. Tonight it was on, the letters bright, and when I watched them, the light hummed a little like the rest of the city lights do. I took the smoke slow and listened to the building's rhythm. There was the distant mechanical thrum of HVAC from a few blocks over, a pigeon somewhere claiming a ledge, Mrs. Patel downstairs calling her son on speaker, and laughing in a way that made me feel less alone. Then, the glow appeared. It wasn't a dot like a plane or a blip like a helicopter's landing lights. It was a white, almost surgical light that hung just over the top floors of the tower, not above or around, like someone had parked a bright lamp right above the building roof. It moved very slowly, less than what I think of as movement in the air, more like a wash that slid along the edge of the clouds. The first thing I noticed was how clean it looked against the night, a compact oval of light with a soft edge, not blasting, just there. The neon logo dimmed a fraction under it as if the glow stole some of its attention. I told myself it was a maintenance lift or something. Working at height with a spotlight to patch a sign, people do that at weird hours. I called my friend Jenna, who works nights at the hospital, said, "You up?" And she replied with a sleepy, "Yeah." And then, because she knows me, "You see anything weird?" I told her about the glow, and she laughed, said maybe someone's got a drone. But her laughter had a hollow cut to it, and she asked a detail I hadn't thought of. "Does it make noise?" I strained my ears. Nothing. Not a mechanical whine, not a rotor chop, just the city's bass line and the soft scrape of my cigarette between my fingers. A minute later, the glow flickered. It was a tiny shuddering at first, like someone flipping a switch quickly. Then there was a soft, uncanny pause. The kind of pause that makes you notice the refrigerator too loud and your own heartbeat. In that pause, every window in that tower went dark at once. I mean, every single one. The entire face of the building that had looked like a spread of lit rooms contracted into one shuttered silhouette. For a beat, I thought the transformer had failed. Then I looked at the other blocks and saw their lights still steady, taxis crawling past, people on the sidewalk talking on phones. It was just the tower. The dark was absolute and exactly simultaneous. No slow fade, no row-by-row blackout like when power companies shut lines down. It was a cut blink off. I raised my phone to record because you do that reflexively. The screen came up, the app opened, and the image stuttered into a smear. My phone logged no service again for a second and then came back. By the time I had the camera running, the tower lights had returned like nothing at all had happened. The neon sign shot back to its bright self as if someone had flicked the lights on. People in the street didn't scream or scatter. A woman on the corner who'd been smoking turned and kept smoking. 30 seconds, maybe less, of darkness, and then nothing. If you'd blinked, you would have missed it. My first impulse was to ask someone else if they'd seen it, so I leaned over the rail and called down to my neighbor Max, 2 floors below. He was the kind of guy who's up late and feeds pigeons on his window ledge, so he's awake for weird. "Hey, did you just see the tower?" I shouted. Max poked his head out, and I could see the glow of his TV inside his room, his hair all over. "What the blackout?" he asked, like I was behind on the neighborhood gossip. Yeah, whole building went dark. I thought they were filming a movie up there. He didn't sound alarmed. He was trying to make himself not alarmed. I went downstairs. In the lobby, Carlos the super was standing with his hand on the intercom. He'd been watching the street through the glass, and he was frowning, like people do when they've seen too many stop signs change at once. Power dropped and came back, he said without being asked. But only at that building. My cousin says sometimes when they test emergency systems in office towers, they do a quick whole building switchover. That sounded plausible. I tried to imagine maintenance crews with bright lamps and tool belts up top, and accepted the idea because adults invent plausible things to sleep at night. Back on the sidewalk, the building looked ordinary. The lobby doors were open, people came and went, and a trio of late shift coders smoked under the awning and argued about an app they were debugging. One of them said, "My wife texted me from the 22nd floor and said the lights went out and then came back." No one screamed or anything? Weird, right? And then the conversation slid back to bugs in the build like nothing odd had just occurred. I called Jenna again, and this time she was awake enough to be sharp. "Hospitals got a string of alarms go off for about 20 minutes, she said, but they were just the UPS test. People call in weird all the time. I asked if her hospital had any staff that night working in that exact tower. She said no, different area code. She told me to stop being dramatic. I wanted to be done with it. That's another thing you learn. If you overfixate on a small impossibility, it takes up a corner of your thinking like a bad splinter. Still, I couldn't shake the way the dark had come, like a single hand over a lamp. The simultaneity made it feel like someone had reached across a building and turned off rooms as if they were light bulbs on a long string. Phones started to pick up again, properly an hour later. People posted pictures to social apps, flat images of a bright building and no visual evidence of the cut because most phones caught it either too early or too late. A tech blog had a short note from someone claiming the building's backup generator had tripped during a test, and everything was nominal. The building manager tweeted something corporate feeling. Brief, isolated power interruption resolved. The tweet used the word resolved in a way that is supposed to end conversations, but there were too many small wedge details that didn't fit the tidy explanation. The smoke shop's camera feed near the intersection had gone dead for exactly 34 seconds, time-stamped, then returned as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Patel, who's always up at weird hours, swore she'd seen shadows moving inside the tower before the lights went out, like curtains shifting though the rooms were empty on that side. Max told me his building's lobby clock blinked once and then read a minute ahead for the rest of the night. My own wristwatch had a second hand that caught a beat later than it should have the next morning, like the day had hiccuped. A week passed and the tower was its same illuminated self during the evenings. People went to work in it, cleaned it, left it, and walked under its awning without mentioning the cut, unless prompted. The city has a way of swallowing oddness into its routines. Still, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd stand on the balcony with nothing but the cold railing in my fingers and watch the block, counting the lit windows like a man counting sheep. Sometimes a pattern of lights would wink out in one office and then come back, like the old building was breathing, and I would blink back to steady myself. I never heard a siren that night for the tower. No emergency crews, no clamber of boots. If there was maintenance, it was quiet, precise, and handled with corporate calm. I emailed the building's management asking if they'd run tests. The only reply I got back was a boilerplate note. Routine maintenance and systems checks may occur. No impact to tenant operations. They thanked me for my patience. I came back inside after the first night and locked the balcony door behind me. I made a cup of coffee, pacing like a person who had seen something and wants it to be sensible. I sat at my table and watched the coffee steam like it marked time. My apartment felt like the rest of the city, functional, noisy in the right corners, indifferent. I slept eventually and kept schedules, paid rent, went to work. The tower's lights still blink and dim in that ordinary way. Once in a while they go dark for a second and then are back. Nothing official to tell you it isn't only your imagination. The thing I can't shake isn't that I saw a glow or that the windows darkened. It's the way everything lined up like a sentence and then left a blank where comprehension should have been. You tell yourself reasonable things, testing, a power hiccup, camera glitches, because you have to live here. But sometimes when I stand on the balcony, cigarette finished, and the city hums its low life around me, I find myself looking at that tower the way you keep an eye on a storm passing slow over the water. Not in fear, not in hope, but because it's a slice of the world behaving slightly off its script, and for reasons I don't have words for, I want to keep watching until the sentence makes sense. I was cruising at 2,500 feet, hand on the throttle, when something that shouldn't have been there slid up beside the left wing. My name's Mark Delaney. I fly a Cessna 172 for myself. Instruction work, odd ferry jobs, the kind of flying that keeps you honest about weather and stick and rudder. That morning, I'd taken off from the grass strip outside of town just after sunrise. It was a clear day, visibility excellent, little high cloud coming in over the range. I had the window cracked, the engine sounded like it always did, and the headset was doing its lazy job of keeping ATC and the world at a sensible distance. Before the thing showed up, there were small, stupid wrongs that I filed away and blamed on being human. About 10 minutes out, the GPS box hiccuped. The little moving map icon froze for a beat, and then jumped a quarter mile to the right, like it had misfiled my position. I glanced down, tapped the unit, and it went back to normal. My heading indicator gave a faint wobble, nothing a quick scan wouldn't sort, and the compass needle did that tiny nothing you would call it wobble pilots notice and say aloud, "Huh," and then look away. I told myself it was electrical noise, an odd bit of interference from a tower or a microwave dish somewhere breakfasting on the horizon. There were other moments that stacked up. A distant high-altitude airliner banked over the far ridge, and the radio static we usually accept as part of the morning chorus swelled for a second and then thinned out. A flock of blackbirds leaked across below us and made a neat silver pattern in the sunlight before scattering. The engine note, I swear to myself I noticed it for a half second lose the tiniest edge, like someone rolled off a piano key. All fixable, all things you talk yourself down from as you reach for a cup of cold coffee at Cloverleaf Fields. It was the kind of morning that lets you stay calm because everything you do has a check on it. Instruments, scan, repeat. Then the shape came up beside us. At first I thought it was another Cessna. Formation flying's common enough in this patchwork of training fields. I glanced in the left mirror, then out the side window. There was a silhouette keeping pace with us at our 12 o'clock, slightly above, maybe 200 feet off the left wing. The oddest thing was the angle. It wasn't oriented like a plane. It sat at a tilt, one edge pointing down into the valley, the other tipped up toward the cloud deck, as if someone had rotated it on an invisible hinge. It maintained that impossible attitude and didn't seem to care about the concept of lift. There were no nav lights, no strobes, nothing to give away the presence of wings or a tail. The surface looked matte, pale against the sky, just enough contrast to cut the sun's sheen into a soft outline. It made no sound, not the faint whine of turbine, not the wind rush you expect when something passes within earshot. For the fraction of a second, I thought of a glider or a banner tow or some experimental ultralight. Then I thought of the practicalities. No pilot would try to hold that angle in an updraft. No FAA-sanctioned glider flies without tow lines in controlled airspace. I did what you're trained to do. I called it in. Traffic at 2 o'clock, same altitude, unknown type, I said into the mic, voice steady enough. Requesting traffic advisory. My hands didn't tremble. You don't want to be the pilot who lets the airplane feel your nerves. The tower was the little approach desk over at the regional field, chipper voice, slow coffee tones. Say again, Mark? Traffic at 2 o'clock? They asked. I described what I could see. The position, the odd angle, the lack of strobes. I expected them to reply with the usual unable or no traffic observed, but I figured they'd at least say they saw something on primary radar. They didn't. We have no targets on the scope in that quadrant, Mark, the controller said. Squawk for us ident. I hit the transponder to 1200 and toggled ident. The little squawk light blinked dutifully, and the ATC voice came back a little flat. No secondary return. I'm not showing anything on primary or secondary in your vicinity. Altitudes, heading. I told them my altitude, heading, position, relative to landmarks. They read back nothing. The audio on the frequency ran normal. A Cessna inbound from the south asking for taxi, a maintenance truck requesting fuel, the world being the world. But the space beside me had that pale, silent presence that stayed level with my left wing. I kept glancing at it. It moved in sync with my plane, not with turbulence or wind. When I made a gentle 3-degree left turn to get a better view, it matched me, holding that slant exactly, never banking cleanly into the turn like a winged aircraft must. I thought about rolling the plane onto its back for a look, the kind of impulse that's almost stupid enough to be brave. Instead, I tightened my scan, kept an eye on instruments, watched the sky. The controller on the ground advised I climb to 3,000 to keep traffic separation. I acknowledged and slowly added power. The shape climbed with me, staying at our left at that impossible easeful angle, still silent enough that the only sounds in the headset were the pumps and the paper squeak of the ATC's log being turned. I repeated my sighting, told them it was maintaining position. The controller repeated back that her radar showed nothing. Mark, are you VFR clear? You're looking at a big bank of cloud to the west. You might be seeing a reflection or a sundog, she said, reasonable as a librarian. I considered sundog. Sundogs are explainable, nice, known. This wasn't a halo effect. This had shape and deliberate motion. I tried to use the hood of my glare shield to cast a shadow and see surface detail, anything. The outline stayed pastel. My brain started making catalogs of aircraft I know. No wings, no empennage, no prop wash. It had sides that suggested structure, not just a puff of cloud. When the angle let a breath of sunlight catch it, there was a subtle texture like brushed metal, dulled. My phone, tucked behind the yoke as a backup camera, was on a sputtering live app I'd tested once for a training piece. I thumbed it, but the app froze. The live feed pixelated and then smudged into blocks. I shoved it back. There's a tidy, ridiculous paranoia that comes with that. I kept imagining I'd suddenly gone blind to the rest of the world, and whatever was at my wing was the only thing that noticed I was there. Then it did the thing that unstitched me. It snapped upward. I don't mean climbed rapidly in a way I can quantify. I mean it shot from our altitude to above the cloud deck in a motion that was more a disappearance than acceleration, the way a cardiogram line plunges flat. One instant, the pale slant filled my peripheral vision. The next it had gone, and where it threaded the clouds, there was no contrail, no turbulence, nothing to mark the path. Radar replay later showed no primary blip. The controller's voice cut in as if on cue. Say your status? I could hear the slight pitch in her tone now, the professional calibration smelling like concern that's been told to behave. Traffic's gone, I said, my voice low. No visual. Affirm, Mark. No targets on radar. Are you declaring an emergency? I hadn't, and I kept myself from doing it because that would summon a set of procedures and people, and I wasn't sure what problem I was calling. I told them I was okay and would continue VFR to the airport. I circled on the expected arrival, did my checklists out loud because pilots do that to keep the machine of actions moving, and watched the cloud bank where the shape had vanished as if it might leak the thing back out. There are mundane ways this could have been explained. A reflection on a lens, a trick of low sun on the edge of cloud, some kind of experimental unmanned thing with stealth tech. But the evidence wasn't tidy. The instruments didn't glitch long enough to be comprehensible. The radar at 2 different centers logged nothing. My own handheld camera unreadably corrupted the frames it tried to take, and the pigeons I saw the day before at the field looked nowhere near as ruffled as I felt. On the ground, the maintenance guys were sympathetic but standard issue skeptical. They asked if I'd filed a report. I filed one with the flight service desk more out of habit than hope. The controller emailed me the radar replay they could share, a flat gray line, planes where they ought to be, a blank space where my brain insisted the thing had been. The replay showed a 9-second smear of noise in one sector, then clean data. The log for the frequency showed my transmission and the short pause where the controller indexed a query and then normal chatter. There were no UFO show headlines in the morning paper, just a brief note in the airport maintenance log about a pilot reporting unidentified traffic. I drove home through a fog that had moved into the valley, hands warm on the steering wheel, and tried to sleep that night by counting the checklist items for an approach over and over because it steadies me. I told a handful of pilot friends, and their faces slid into the professional tolerance for the strange and then back. One of them, Lisa, who flies charters out of the coast, said people see weird things sometimes, bright objects, reflections, lights, and she shrugged in the way of someone who knows the margin for error in eyes and instruments. Another sent me a clip of a Chinese research paper about radar anomalies over mountain ranges, but admitted it didn't quite match. What stays with me isn't a sensation of cosmic terror. It's the specific ordinariness of it. The prop, the needles, the hum of breath in the headset. The thing had been precise in its wrongness. The most practical fact is this. I flew the plane back, logged my time, did the squawk test, and walked away with my logbook the same, my passengers none the wiser. No one was harmed. I came home, drank too much coffee, and looked out the kitchen window at the sky until it was daylight and normal. I don't have a neat ending. The radar file I was sent is a flat line with a small notch of static where my words met their blanks. The camera files are corrupted in a way that leaves me with a smeared frame in the middle of a clear take. People I told either ask practical questions or smile in a way that says, "Pilot stories are full of weather." I keep thinking about the way it matched my turn, the way it climbed without passing through the wake, the exactness of its timing. I fly again, because the job and because flying is what I know how to do when the sky feels otherwise. I was tracking a deer that had vanished into the lower saplings when I heard the first click. Name's Eli Mercer. I hunt around the Huntley Ridge a couple times a month. Public land, rough track, enough oak and hemlock that the deer have places to hide and a man can practice patience. I had taken the little logging trail farther than I usually do because the wind was good and there'd been fresh sign, a scrape, a rub, a faint drag in the leaves. It was late October and the dusk came quick. The air was the cold kind that makes your lungs taste like metal. I'd been wearing my orange vest, had the Thompson over my shoulder, the bipod folded under, and my old Zeiss scope on the rifle. I like that scope. It's simple, clear, none of that glare nonsense. The woods were the usual evening orchestra when I left the truck. Cicadas winding down, a thin line of crickets, occasional far-off bark of hounds. By the time I pushed through the last stand of saplings, the songs were thinning, and the sky over the ridge was the flat color of old nickel. The light was going the way it always does out there, honest and fast. I wasn't worried about being late. I'd planned on moving slow, following the scrape. The first odd thing was small. The birds cut out. 1 second there were robins and a thrush working the understory, and then nothing. A hard quiet slid over the ridge like someone pulled a blanket. It's not the kind of quiet that means there's a storm coming. It was the animal hush, the one that settles when something in the woods has noticed something and decided to be polite about alarm. My hair went a little up on my neck. I kept moving, but quieter, and the sound of my own boots on leaf litter sounded too loud. A minute later, something knocked. 3 times. Not a branch falling, not the hollow nook of a woodpecker. 3 clean, hollow clicks, spaced, echoing uphill and then settling into the trees. The sound came from above me, not out ahead or behind. It was sharp enough that I stopped and put a hand on my rifle barrel purely out of habit. I didn't want to look up because up is where you see the sky, and I wanted the deer, but I had to. I saw the trunks, the branches, the gray sky, and then the second click, and my head went up. There was a dark triangle moving just above the treetops, matte black, no shine. It wasn't high and it wasn't low, just barely clearing the canopy. The edges were straight, the shape precise, the underside flat against the sky like someone had laid a board over the tops of the trees. It moved with a slow, deliberate glide. No sound. Nothing like the trucked-in chatter of a crop duster or the obvious sweep of a satellite. If I squinted, it was like a paper airplane cut out of shadow and set loose. I've seen owls and big raptors sit on thermals at dusk and their noisy wings even at a distance. This thing made no sound. There was no rotor wash bending the highest branches, no echo of a whine through the holler. It passed over the oaks with a movement that felt patient, like it was scanning the ground for something and taking its time. The second time it passed my position, because it made a slow circle, I heard two more clicks, spaced the same as the first three. After the last echo, the birds stayed quiet. I remember the ordinary things that happened to keep my own head steady. Check the safety, keep the barrel pointed downrange, breathe slow. I learned long ago not to do anything dramatic in the woods. I shouldered the rifle and eased to a knoll so I could see the ridge line ahead. My scope was dialed for distance. I lifted and the reticle found the triangle as a dark patch against a steel sky. That's when the scope fogged from the inside. I'll never forget that little dot of steam that gathered under the glass like a mouthy exhale. It clouded across the lenses and blurred the silhouette into soft charcoal. I took the rifle down to my knee and wiped the eyepiece with my sleeve. Nothing. The fog was on the inside and it smeared no matter how I wiped. It cleared a hair at the center where I'd breathed and then blurred again. I set the butt of the rifle into my shoulder and tried to look along the barrel, past the glass, and the triangle, when I could make it out, had slid down between the trees and come back up along a different vector, like it was mapping the understory. It wasn't a plane, not in any way I know. I thought maybe some hunter with a homemade kite or a remote glider, but anyone piloting that low would make sound and leave a wake in branches. No wake. When it was over the north copse again, it seemed to hesitate and then accelerate. One clean motion, almost vertical, and the sky swallowed it. There was no contrail, no vapor, no sound of blades cutting air. The only thing left was my breath fogging because I'd suddenly held my breath too long. When it lifted like that, time didn't jump exactly, but my watch was off. I checked the cheap digital on my wrist because old habits are good. It read 5:26. I remember thinking I'd been out longer. My mind had been counting minutes, and they felt longer, like someone stretched a strip of film. Later that night, the watch would be 2 minutes different from the truck clock. That's the kind of small wrong that nags you more than a big wrong does. After the triangle vanished, the birds came back in a cautious ripple. A squirrel barked its complaint 3 trees over. The wind crept in and the woods resumed the ordinary hiss they always have. My legs were rubbery, but I'm not proud of sharp panic. I worked my way back along the deer's path slowly, keeping my shoulders low and my steps soft. The scrape was real, fresh, like the buck had only just moved through. Antler hair stuck to the bark. Tracks in the mud. Whatever had been up there moved like it was studying ground sign. I told myself a dozen reasonable things on the walk back. Maybe a late hunter had a bird hunting decoy on a line. Maybe someone had launched a dark kite from a clearing. Maybe I'd misread distance and the triangle was farther away than it looked. The problem with each theory was the scope fog. I'm a practical man, and equipment leaves traces. You get fog from moisture and temperature shifts, from breathing when the glass is cold, from using a lens in rain, but fools forget the absurdity that things like scope fogging from the inside feel less like nature and more like an object touching the same space your eyes use. I reached the truck before full dark. The parking pullout was empty, but for the dull glow of my brake lights. The heater in the cab was still warm from earlier. I sat with the engine idling and fingers on the wheel while the wool of my jacket dried slowly. I thumbed open my phone, but bars were scarce the way they get under canopy. A text from Louis, my buddy who usually meets me at the ridge now and then, blinked. "You call me?" He'd been in town and said he'd seen 2 kids with a drone near the feed store earlier, but he shrugged it off. I didn't want to make small talk. I drove home slow on the holler roads, headlights cutting the mist. The radio caught a faint AM hymn station and then went silent for a stretch where static swallowed whole songs. I thought about reporting it to the game warden, but the last time I'd called in on something odd, someone's fire that turned out to be a controlled burn, made me feel small. There's a kind of private shame in telling a story that can be shrugged away. So I told no one at first, not until I'd sat in the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt paper and listened to it steam. The scope cleared in the place it always clears, when the ambient temp inside the cab met the glass and the condensation evaporated. I cleaned the lens with a proper rag later and looked for salt or residue. Nothing. I can't find fingerprints for reasons that make sense. At the rifle shop the next weekend, a man named Gabe told me sometimes scopes fog in weird ways. He had 100 explanations. Seals that fail, tiny breaks where humidity gets in on a long hunt. He checked the eyepiece, turned the tube in the sun, and handed it back like a man dealing with the weather. I slept badly that night. My dog, Rex, padded in and out of the bedroom like he was checking doors. In the middle of the night, I went outside and stood by the back fence with a cigarette and watched the ridge. There was nothing, only the flat wash of stars I'm used to seeing. Occasionally a plane traced across the sky far high, polite and loud enough you knew it had engines. None of them were that triangle. I thought about what it had done, how it had wound along the treetops as if reading every line of bark. I thought about how my scope criticized me in that exact moment and how easily all the world goes back to normal after something odd slips by. I told Luis the next afternoon because not saying things makes them larger in your head. He listened and clicked his tongue a few times. "You sure it wasn't a banner tow or parasail?" he said. He asked if I had trail cam footage or quick notes. I had nothing. The other men at the feed store had their own stories, little bright things over cornfields in summer, a light that hung by a silo and then moved on. We swapped tales like old men swap recipes, half one-up and half disbelief. No one offered a satisfying explanation. A week passed and I went back to the ridge twice because hunting is what you do and you don't hand your woods over to a memory. Nothing else turned up. The deer were where deer are, the rut moved along and the world stayed the world. But every time the sky on a late afternoon went that steel nickel color, I found my eyes lifting without meaning to, tracking the treetops for a clean black edge. There are things I can't prove and things I know I saw. The triangle was one of them. My truck clock and my watch disagree by 2 minutes if you ask them. Annoying, small, unnecessary. My scope fogged from the inside and I can't find a mechanical reason for it that sits clean in the world. The woods sometimes muzzled their sounds in a way that put me on my heels. None of it culminated in a catastrophe. I came home, I cleaned my rifle, I mended a strap on my pack, I went back out the next weekend with a friend. We walked the rusted boots path and left our own marks. The compass didn't twitch and the birds sang again. At night, when the house is quiet and the kettle is making its small protest, I will catch myself glancing up at the tree line from the kitchen window like a man habitually checking his doors. The ridge looks ordinary under the moon. But the odd little things sit in my head in a row, the clicks first among them, and I find myself slowing down when I pass any stand of oaks, listening for anything that isn't wind. I was driving home from work on that Thursday around 7:30 in the evening. The sky had that dull pink hue that comes right before full sunset. Nothing dramatic, just that sort of washed out color that makes the trees look darker than they are. I had left the office later than usual because of a pile of paperwork, and the highway was practically empty except for a few other cars heading the same way. I usually take the county road that cuts past the old Miller farm, the one that's been abandoned for years. The fields there stretch out for miles, flat and wide, with nothing to block the view. I like it because it's peaceful, even when I'm stuck thinking about work. That night, though, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a reflection from my own windshield, or maybe a glint off a silo, I don't know. But it stayed in the same spot as I drove closer, so that didn't make sense. I slowed down and squinted. Hovering just above the northern edge of the field was a silver object. It wasn't huge, maybe the size of a small car, but it was completely still in the air. No blinking lights, no rotor noise, nothing. Just this reflective silver shape, perfectly stationary. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a trick of the light, but it stayed there as I got nearer. I even rolled down the window, half expecting to hear wind or some kind of mechanical hum. There was nothing except the normal sounds of the road and my tires on the asphalt. I don't know why, but I instinctively took the next left onto the old gravel road that runs along the field. I wanted a better angle, maybe to see if I could make out details. The gravel crunched under my tires and the car's headlights swept across the field as I slowed to a stop. And it was gone. The field was empty. Just the grass and wildflowers and the outline of a fence at the far end. No object, no shimmer, no nothing. I checked around, even drove back and forth slowly, hoping I just misjudged the angle. Nothing. Not even a shadow where it had been hovering. I sat in the car for a while, the engine ticking as it cooled, trying to make sense of it. The air felt heavy, warmer than it had been just a minute ago, and I noticed the usual sounds of evening. The crickets, the wind through the grass, were quieter than normal, almost muted. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my eyes had caught a reflection off a cloud, or maybe the sun lingering on a piece of metal. But my gut told me I hadn't. There was a clarity to the shape, a presence. I drove slowly back onto the main road, keeping my eyes on the field. Still nothing. The world had resumed its normal rhythm. The birds that were still awake chirped, a distant dog barked, and the faint hum of a tractor from a neighbor's property drifted over. Everything normal, except for what I had seen. I took a detour through the next subdivision, trying to shake the unease. Lights came on in houses as people returned from work. Kids yelled from yards. Nothing seemed out of place except me, my pulse, and that image I couldn't erase. At one point, I caught a glint in the rearview mirror, something low to the ground, reflective again, but when I swerved slightly to look, it was gone. No vehicle, no animal, just the road and empty yards. I shook my head, laughed quietly at myself, and kept driving. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had fully set, leaving a soft violet haze over the neighborhood. I left the car running for a moment, staring out at the horizon beyond my house. The field past the next row of houses was dark, nothing to hint at what I'd seen. Inside, my husband asked how the drive was. I told him uneventful, nothing to report. I couldn't bring myself to describe it. The words felt wrong or too weird, or maybe I wasn't sure I believed them myself. That night, when I went to bed, I kept seeing it in my mind. The object, hovering perfectly still, reflecting light off its surface, as if it had weight but no sound. My dreams were fragmented, nothing concrete, just flashes of silver against pink sky, like looking through the corner of my own memory. The next day, I drove past the field again during my lunch break. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No disturbance in the grass, no evidence it had been there. The farm was as empty as ever, weeds growing along the fence line, the old barn doors hanging loose. A week later, I asked a coworker if they'd seen anything unusual, planes, helicopters, even a hot air balloon. They said no. I tried online forums about strange sightings in the area, but found nothing that matched the time or place. Still, I catch myself glancing at that field whenever I drive past, hoping maybe for a glimpse again. Most days it's just grass and fence posts and the fading remains of the old barn. But some nights, especially when the light hits the horizon just right, I swear I can see a silver shimmer, low and still, hovering above the grass, waiting. I've driven that road dozens of times since, alone and with friends, during the day and at dusk. Nothing ever appears again, but the memory of that shape, perfectly still, and the way the evening grew quiet around it, hasn't left me. Even now, when I pass the field, I check the sky first, just in case. I pulled over on a rutted 2-track when the sky went weird. I'd been chasing the cell all afternoon, hot, muggy air bulging off the highway, the kind of late May day that makes the whole sky feel like it's waiting. My name's Ben. I do freelance storm work with a beat-up Subaru and a dash cam that's seen better storms. I wasn't out for a record or fame, just the next decent wall cloud and whatever footage I could stitch together for the weather shows. The field off County Road 12 had a dark, low base, and the wind had that tight metallic smell before anything obvious happened. I killed the engine, put the camera on the hood, and watched. A few small things felt off before anything really happened. First, the birds. The swallows that had been skimming over a drainage ditch 2 minutes earlier vanished like someone closed a curtain. It wasn't just quieter. The entire layer of little flight calls stopped dead. Then my radio started to hiss. Not the usual chatter, but a thin, high static that would climb and fall without a pattern. My phone, which had been steady on full bars, flashed "no service" for a beat, and then came back as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was all normal. Atmospheric propagation, ionospheric weirdness, whatever the forecasters say when radios play up. But my gut notice is old at this. I've been out on nights where storms behaved normally and nights where they didn't, and that bird silence was the sort that tightens your shoulders. The wall cloud dropped fast. 1 minute the base was low and things smooth, the next it had a lip and a darker core. Wind gusted from the southeast, and the tall corn in the fields lay flat in sheets. I could hear the blades of the grass snap under pressure in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I threw the dash cam at the windshield mount, which doesn't do much but keeps a steady picture for whatever I catch. That's when the funnel dropped. Thin at first, then thickening like someone had pulled taffy. It didn't look cinematic. It looked practical. A rope of condensed cloud with dust beginning to spiral at its base. Trucks on the far county road slowed to a crawl. A farmer in a pickup turned off his lights and parked on the shoulder. He waved at me like we were sharing a private thing of necessity. And then the lights appeared. Inside the pipe, maybe halfway up the visible column, 3 lights were locked in place. They weren't strobes or aircraft nav lights. They were steady, sharp, white, arranged roughly in a triangle with one point downward. The funnel was whipping and tearing at the field, and the air around it had teeth, but those lights sat steady as a lamp on a table. They didn't jitter with the gusts. They didn't smear with the speed of the rotation. It looked wrong in the exact, precise way that makes every hair on your neck honest. I raised my camera and zoomed until the image pixelated. The lights held. My recorder picked up nothing different. No extra frequencies, no mechanical whine. Just the ambient roar of wind and distant thunder. I got out of the car because that's what you do. You want the unobstructed angle, the sound that fills the chest. The porch of old corn and telephone poles leaned under the pressure of the storm. When I walked forward, the grit of soil was knocked at my boots like little bullets. A bolt hit to my left, bright, close, and it cracked the world open like a fist. The 3 lights vanished the instant the lightning lanced through the column. One fraction of a second they were there, the next nothing in that exact patch of sky. The funnel went on. No dramatic collapse at that moment, but the memory of those lights had a kind of absence, the shape of a hand. I blinked hard and checked the footage. The file shows the funnel and then a bright flash, and then the funnel continuing without its interior lights. After the strike, the whole storm acted like a thing embarrassed. Winds shifted, the gust front rolled through, and what had been a steady climb of electricity dropped into regular thunder. The radio that had been hissing came back to life with a dispatcher asking for reports. My phone chirped a dozen messages from other chasers. Did you see that? Lights inside? One text had a shaky clip from a passenger in another car. The lights are visible on a few frames and then gone. People started to respond in real time, trading coordinates and guesses like a sport. I drove closer when the funnel moved off the field and the county patrol waved traffic away. The farmer's truck was gone. He'd already headed to his cellar. I parked under a telephone pole because it felt safer for reasons I couldn't explain and watched the cloud pull east. For a long time afterward, all the small electronics around me behaved like a fridge motor. They hummed and clicked, a beat late. My headlamp dimmed for a second when I tried to jog video on a small handheld, and the minute it came back, the footage had a single frame where the lights were bright and then nothing. People in town called it later a power surge, a trick of light. I called it what it was, the footage in my camera and the farmer's dash cam backing me up. The National Weather Service logged an event. A tornado touchdown reported, no fatalities, property damage minimal. They didn't say anything about 3 steady lights in a rotating column. Official reports don't usually do that. I sent the raw clip to a couple of meteorologist friends, and one of them emailed me back with a cautious, interesting. Glints off hail, maybe? With a shrug emoji. Another asked for GPS timestamps. I packed up before the storm could remind me how small we are. Driving back to the county line, the fields smelled like wet iron and corn, and something clung to the air that my chest kept trying to measure. I was tired in the way people are after close, precise fear, awake and too alert. I went home, unloaded the rig, and watched the footage again on my laptop with the sound down, pausing at the frames where the lights sat like frozen buds inside the funnel. I posted a clipped version to my feed for other chasers. The comments filled with reasonable, skeptical, and excitable replies. That's the mix storms attract. By morning, everything on the field looked like it had always looked. Flattened rows in the corn, a few broken fence posts, a farmer who squinted at me over his coffee and said he'd seen the funnel but didn't see no lights, boy. I don't blame him. People look at weather and see what they know how to see. I kept the raw files and the timestamps and a jaw that felt a little loose from the thunder. I don't have an answer. The footage is there, and I have the memory of 3 steady points holding inside a thing that should have torn them to pieces. I have a dash cam, a farmer's video, and a radio log that shows a spike at the exact second the flash hits. I slept that night with the laptop closed and the phone on the bedside table. The next day, I drove past the county road where I'd left the car, and the grass bent the same way. People go back to work. Corn keeps swelling. The sky keeps doing what sky does. The lights are still in my camera files, stubborn and inexplicable, and I keep opening them, not because I want an answer, but because I want to remember precisely what looked wrong against everything we think we understand. I was stationed at a site near Groom Lake in 2011, working as a junior radar tech. Nothing glamorous. Most of my shifts were spent in a dimly lit control room with 2 other guys watching screens that hardly ever changed. We monitored air traffic around the ranges, logged activity, checked for anomalies. 90% of the time, it was dull. Training flights, test patterns, calibration runs. You write down the times, keep the data clean, and hand it off at the end of the shift. It was the middle of summer, one of those weeks where the desert heat doesn't really let up, even at night. I was on the midnight shift, which usually meant just staring at a radar scope for hours while sipping bad coffee and trying not to fall asleep. The room had no windows, just the low hum of the equipment and the occasional squawk from a headset if there was traffic. Around 0140, something unusual popped up on my screen. A return registered at the far edge of the runway, like something had just powered up there. At first I thought it was a glitch, maybe a reflection or bad data, but the track was solid, not flickering like noise. It looked exactly like an aircraft preparing for takeoff. I marked it in the log, like I was supposed to. New contact, runway origin, holding position. Nothing odd yet, but I remember leaning closer, frowning at the scope. The altitude read 0, the speed almost nothing, but the return was sharp. Then, in a blink, the blip shot forward. The system updated so fast it almost smeared across the display. The acceleration wasn't gradual, it went from stationary to hundreds of knots instantly. Within 2 sweeps of the radar, it had cleared the base perimeter. By the 3rd sweep, it was off the scale. I stared at the numbers. The speed readout climbed past Mach 3, then Mach 6, then it stopped showing anything useful. The system just dumped dashes, like it couldn't calculate anymore. I called over to Jim, another tech who'd been there longer than me. "Hey, you seeing this?" He rolled his chair over, squinting at my scope. For a second, his mouth opened like he was going to say something. Then he leaned back, rubbed his face, and muttered, "Don't." He turned away without another word and went back to his own console. I sat there, heart hammering, watching the blip streak off into nothing. The track line stretched to the edge of the display and vanished. I wrote it down anyway. 0143, unknown departure, impossible acceleration. I underlined it because my brain couldn't process what I'd just seen. Less than a minute later, the entry blinked off my log, just gone. The line I'd typed was replaced with an empty row, like it had never existed. I tried re-entering it, but the system wouldn't let me. The cursor just refused to move onto that time slot. I checked the backup console, same thing. Clean logs, no trace of what I just watched. Before I could say anything, the supervisor came in. It was unusual for him to check in that late, but there he was, coffee cup in hand, expression flat. He walked straight over to me, looked at my screen, then at me. "You didn't see anything," he said. His voice wasn't threatening, but it was final. I tried to say something. It logged a takeoff, sir, but..." He cut me off. "No, it didn't. Don't put it in writing again. Don't talk about it again." "Clear?" I nodded. My mouth was dry. He stared at me another moment, then walked out like it was just another routine check. The rest of the shift crawled by. I couldn't stop glancing at the runway on the scope, half expecting something else to appear. Nothing did. By the time morning came, I felt like I dreamed the whole thing. But when I left the building, I noticed something strange. The air outside smelled faintly metallic, almost like ozone after a lightning strike, even though the sky was perfectly clear. The guards at the gate were quieter than usual too, faces unreadable behind their sunglasses, like they were waiting for something. That day, I went back to my quarters and lay on the bunk for hours, replaying it in my head. A craft leaving the runway, accelerating faster than anything I'd ever heard of, then vanishing from the radar in seconds. Logs auto-cleared. Supervisors shutting it down immediately. I worked there another 7 months. Nothing like that ever showed on my screen again. But I also never stopped thinking about how quick my supervisor had been to appear. Like he already knew what had happened before I even called it out. When my contract was up, I left Nevada and never reapplied. I told myself it was just a glitch, a bad read. But I know what I saw on that scope, and I know I didn't imagine the way the data disappeared right in front of me. I was going through some old storage boxes at home a few months back, trying to declutter, when I came across a stack of photos my grandfather had kept. He was a retired airman, Charles Chuck Whitman, and spent most of his career around the Nevada Test and Training Range. I'd grown up hearing stories about the base, Area 51, all the usual stuff, secret projects, experimental aircraft, but never much concrete. I guess I thought the stories were just that, stories. Anyway, these photos were mostly black and white from the 50s. Chuck had labeled some of them, mostly snapshots of runways, barracks, the occasional aircraft lined up neatly on the tarmac. Nothing too unusual. I was flipping through them on a rainy Sunday morning, sunlight dim through the blinds, when I stopped at one photo that didn't make sense. It was a standard runway shot, taken from what looked like a guard tower. You could see a few trucks and personnel moving about. Nothing that screamed classified at first glance. But then I noticed something in the background, half hidden behind a hangar. A craft. It was small, sleek, dark, with a shape that didn't resemble anything I recognized from the period. No wings like a jet, no tail fins, just smooth, almost teardrop shaped. The strange part, it looked identical to a prototype I'd seen a few years ago during a test briefing at the base. Same size, same shape, same metallic reflection. I blinked a few times, leaning closer. Couldn't be. That aircraft shouldn't exist in the 50s. I called my cousin, Matt, who's a hobbyist historian with a focus on Cold War aviation. He looked at it over video chat, adjusting the contrast and zooming in on the background. "That's weird," he said finally. "It looks like one of the newer stealth test drones, but this photo is dated 1954. How does that even happen?" I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the labeling was wrong. But then I pulled out more photos from the same box, various angles of the same base, all from the early 50s. Each time, in the same corner of the frame, there it was. Always partially obscured, never fully in focus, almost like someone, or something, was careful not to let you get a clear look. That evening, I dug out some of Chuck's old notebooks. They weren't much at first, flight logs, maintenance notes, but in one of the later journals dated 1953, I found a reference to a special operations prototype with only a vague description. Unconventional, smooth, unmarked, observed only in limited test conditions. No drawings, no technical details. I drove down to the range the next morning. I figured maybe seeing the area would help me contextualize what I'd found. The desert was quiet, early fog rolling off the mountains. I parked near the perimeter, far enough to avoid attention, and watched the horizon. Not more than 30 minutes in, I saw a glint, a shape rising from behind one of the distant hangars. It hovered briefly, then shot straight up at a speed that made me stumble back. My camera's autofocus freaked out. I managed a single frame before it vanished behind a low bank of clouds. The weirdest part wasn't just seeing the craft. It was that when I checked the photo, there was a faint haze, almost like static, covering the shape. The camera had registered movement, but somehow the outline wasn't fully there. My heart was racing, and I noticed that my surroundings felt different. The desert was too quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the usual hum from the distant generators. Just that odd, empty silence. I stayed for a couple more hours, watching. Every now and then, small lights would flicker across the horizon, like someone moving reflective markers, except nothing appeared on the ground when I tried to track them. I felt like I was being watched, though every time I spun around, there was no one. Just the desert, the mountains, and the base perimeter fencing. On my way back, I noticed my car felt lighter. Not physically, but the sense that something had changed in my perspective. Like time had stretched, then compressed. I got home and everything seemed normal, except for the photo I had taken. Half the image was blank where the craft had been. I tried reloading it, connecting the SD card to my computer, even opening it in different programs. Nothing. It just wouldn't show the craft. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo from the 50s. How had that craft been there? Was someone testing advanced technology decades ahead of schedule, or was it something else entirely? Chuck never mentioned anything like that in his journals, at least not in words I could understand. And the craft I saw rising from behind the hangar looked identical, down to the subtle curvature of its body, to the one in the old photograph. The following week, I went back to the storage box just to see if I had missed anything. There were more photos, more angles, but in all of them, the craft was there, partially hidden, always in the background. The more I looked, the more I felt like it had been watching, like it didn't want to be fully seen. I tried asking around carefully to people I trusted. Nobody had seen anything, and some gave me that blank, uneasy look like they thought I'd gone off the deep end. Military records for that period are classified, naturally, but even among retired personnel, no one would admit to having knowledge of something like that. I kept the photos, of course. I sometimes take them out and study the hangar angles, the shadows, the background. And sometimes late at night, I imagine the craft rising from behind the hangar, just like it did that foggy morning, silent, fast, and completely untraceable. I don't know what it is, a prototype hidden for decades, something that doesn't belong to us, or maybe it's a trick of light, memory, and the desert stretching your mind. All I know is that photo doesn't lie, even if no one else can see it. And seeing that same shape today, decades later, hovering above the same base, made me realize that whatever it is, it doesn't obey our rules. I've stopped trying to explain it. I just look at the photos, sometimes the video I caught, and leave it at that. There's a line in the desert, and apparently I walked right up to it. The craft exists in the past and present, but every recording, every attempt to document it, seems determined to vanish. All I can do is keep the images, keep the memory, and accept that there's something out there that doesn't care about our timeline, our cameras, or our understanding. I went back to work, to the normal routines of life, but every now and then, when the wind shifts just right, I see that same shape in the corner of my eye, and I remember the photo from the 50s. It's still there, watching, waiting, and somehow unchanged. I woke up to a light. That was the first thing I remember. Not a sound, not movement, but this faint, steady glow bleeding through the nylon walls of my tent. It was pale, almost white, with the slightest hint of blue, and it didn't pulse like a flashlight or flicker like a fire. It was just there, even and soft, bright enough to make me squint while lying in my sleeping bag. I wasn't supposed to be seeing any light. I was camped alone, miles off a logging road in northern Vermont, on the edge of a small clearing near a stream. I had hiked in during the day, pitched camp before sunset, cooked dinner on my little stove, and gone to bed early. No one else was out there. I hadn't even seen another car at the trailhead. At first I thought maybe the moon had broken through the clouds. It had been overcast when I'd gone to bed, but the glow didn't feel like moonlight. It was too focused, too direct. My tent was lit up evenly on all sides, like something was hovering just above me. I lay there holding my breath, waiting for it to fade. It didn't. The glow just kept on, steady and strange. I finally sat up, unzipped the top of my sleeping bag, and listened. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps. The usual night sounds, the stream nearby, the faint buzz of insects, were gone too. The silence hit me like a weight. I reached for my watch and saw it was just after 2 in the morning. My phone was off to save battery, but I didn't touch it. I just sat there, staring at the walls of the tent, trying to convince myself I wasn't seeing what I was seeing. Eventually, curiosity got the better of fear. I leaned forward and unzipped the flap a few inches. The light outside was so strong compared to the darkness inside that I had to blink to adjust. When I pulled the flap open wider, the glow shifted. Not abruptly, not like someone switched it off, but like it drew itself upward. The clearing outside was washed in that same pale blue light, as if the grass and trees had been dipped in frost. Shadows stretched in every direction, sharp and unnatural, like the source was directly above. I tilted my head back and saw it. No shape, no edges, just the glow itself. It was concentrated above my tent, low enough that I felt like I could almost reach it with a tall stick. Then, as I stared, it started pulling upward, shrinking as though someone was reeling it in on a line. The higher it went, the dimmer it became, until it was just a faint smudge against the clouds. A second later, it was gone completely, swallowed by the overcast sky. The darkness that rushed in after was almost worse. My eyes strained to readjust. The clearing looked the way it had when I'd set up camp. Black trees, silver-gray grass in the starlight, nothing moving. The normal sounds hadn't returned yet. It was just me sitting there, the flap half open, waiting. I don't know how long I sat like that. Could have been a minute, could have been 10. Eventually, I zipped the flap shut, lay back in my bag, and forced myself to keep breathing steady. I thought about packing up right then and hiking out, but the idea of walking miles through pitch-black woods after what I'd just seen felt worse. Somewhere around 4, I must have drifted into a light sleep. When I woke again, it was morning. The clouds had cleared and the sun was hitting the tops of the trees. Everything looked ordinary, except for one thing. In the grass just outside my tent, the dew had been disturbed. Not trampled exactly, but pressed down in a perfect circle, about 10 feet across. The blades bent outward, radiating from the center, as though something had hovered close enough to push them flat. I stood there staring at it with my coffee in hand, steam rising into the cool morning air, and I couldn't think of a single explanation that fit. There had been no wind, no animals that big, no people, just me, and that light. I broke camp not long after, packed everything as quickly as I could, slung my pack over my shoulders, and left the clearing behind. But I can still picture that glow, the way it slid upward when I looked at it, like it had been caught in the act. I was on the porch because the house felt too still inside. It had been one of those long days at the clinic. Back-to-back appointments, charts to fill out, the kind of small nagging errors that make you check a patient's name twice. I left my bag by the door, poured a glass of something iced and weak, and settled into the swing with a blanket over my knees. It was late May, warm enough that the nights hung soft, but cool enough that you wanted a little something over your legs. The porch light cast that familiar yellow pool over the steps. The rest of the yard dissolved into hedges and the big maple that leans toward the fence. At first, nothing was odd. The neighborhood was whispering. Somewhere a TV murmured through an open window. A distant car passed, a dog barked twice, and then went on with its night. The little radio on the kitchen counter had been set to low earlier, and its tinny voice floated out the back window for a bit, then faded as people turned off screens. I watch the sky because I do. It's a small ritual, a way to tell the day it's over. The moon was a sliver, and the first stars were pricking out like points on black velvet. I had Rosie, our old beagle, curled at my feet, nose tucked. She stirred sometimes and then settled. That's when the first small thing happened. The crickets that had been making a steady undercurrent of sound cut off. Not a fade out, more like someone snapped a hand over the band. One moment they were there, the next the yard felt like a room with the TV paused. I noticed it the way you notice when the refrigerator stops humming. It's such a minor absence it makes the whole house feel less certain. Rosie lifted her head and looked up at the maple, ears up in that anxious, listening way dogs have. She never did that without reason. I put my glass down and listened. For a while, there was nothing but the far highway and the faint thunk of a screen door down the block. I thought maybe wind had died away. That happens sometimes in the valleys. Little pockets of perfect stillness where the air holds. Then the porch bulb dimmed. Not a flicker or a pop. It softened like someone let the wattage down. The light pool across the steps thinned and a bar of the swing chair threw a longer shadow. I told myself the bulb was old and that I'd replace it in the morning. I told myself many small, sensible things that night. The porch light brightened again after a few heartbeats, steady and normal, and I settled back. A little later, the clock on the stove, the kind with green LED numbers, blipped. It jumped forward by 2 minutes, then back. The soundless tick of the kitchen clock settling felt oddly loud in a night that had lost its crickets. I picked up my phone to check the time. The screen showed a single bar, and the tiny circle of searching that means the network was on vacation. My thumb hovered over the screen like I might prod it back into life. Rosie gave a small bark at the maple and stood up. She padded to the edge of the porch and peered into the yard, tail not wagging, just tense. I went with her and leaned on the rail. The sky glittered. The maple's leaves were black cutouts against it. You could see Orion if you knew where to look. I know because I used to drag my kids out to the park and name the shapes. A single star on the left side of the sky caught my eye. It was one of those first bright ones, maybe a planet even. It hung steady and white. I watched it for no reason other than habit. And then the star brightened. Not slowly, not like the way light seems to bloom when cloud thins. It brightened fast. In the space of a breath, it went from a distant pin to something like a small, very distant bulb turned up to a glare. The change was instantaneous enough that it felt like a cut. The whole yard filled with a soft, pale light that wasn't warm the way porch light is. It was cool, almost silver. It flattened colors into a high-contrast sketch. Roses that had been coral took on a hard white edge. The grass showed each blade like the slats of a paintbrush. When the light hit us, I felt the hairs along my forearms stand up. The air didn't change temperature. If anything, it felt a degree thinner, like the night had been sipped. The light was not a beam. It didn't have a cone or a focused source. It was like the sky had decided to be a lamp, and the lamp had been set on the map of my yard. Shadows sharpened immediately. The house across the street, dark and shuttered, looked as if someone had taken a photograph and pushed the exposure. Even Rosie's eyes reflected the silver in a way I'd never seen. The first thought was practical. Someone with a flashlight on the hill, a sport camera, a spotlight from a truck. But the glow didn't move like any of those things. It didn't come from the road. It came from the sky, up where stars live. It wasn't a plane. I would have heard a motor or seen strobes. There was no sound beyond the distant highway and that small, tight noise of my chest. I called my name out because calling your own name is a thing you can do when the night stretches and you want someone else to witness it, to fold it into normal. Evan, I said, come here. My husband's voice floated from the kitchen window where he'd been fixing something sensible. He always tucks tools away by the sink, and when he answered, I could hear his feet on the tile. I said, outside, now. It was stupidly abrupt, and I knew it, but I wanted him there. By the time he came to the door, the light had eased. The star had returned to its ordinary pin, and the yard had the same gold puddle on the steps from the porch bulb. Evan stepped out, rubbing his hands like he was cold, though the air wasn't. What? He started. The star, I said. It lit up the whole yard. My voice sounded very small. I had the sense of saying something that would make him fold it into a sensible story. Some electrical blip, neighborhood prank, but the tremor in my hands made me honest. He looked up where I'd been looking and squinted. The pinprick of the star was there, innocent and wrong. I don't see anything, he said after a second, like he might have missed the end of my sentence or the point altogether. He came closer and put an arm around my shoulders, the way he does when someone else is rattled. You sure you didn't just catch lightning or a plane? He asked. No, I said. It was bright. It lit everything, like daylight. I told him how the shadows had become sharp and how the roses looked white-edged. I told him Rosie had looked at the sky like she'd seen a person. He listened the way he always does, slow and available. And then, without meaning to sound unhelpful, he said, maybe your eyes were tired. We stood there in the cooling gold of the porch bulb, and I watched his face look for the practical thing. He was trying on reasons the same way someone tries on coats to see which fit. I wanted him to say, I saw it too, because shared witnesses make events less slippery. But he didn't. He only said, want me to check the street? and I said yes. He walked to the edge of the yard, down the path, and leaned over the low fence. The street was the same as always, a parked car near the lamppost, a silhouette of a man walking his dog farther down, the soft orange of sodium lights. He checked over his shoulder and then came back without looking alarmed. "Nothing odd," he said. He tried the radio in the kitchen, flipped through channels. The tiny blue LED on the stove blinked its clock, the same numbers as before, 11:43, and didn't stutter. The router's little light kept blinking its polite pattern. My phone, which had shown 1 bar, came back to full signal as if the world had never been absent for a second. The porch bulb held steady. The sky, to everything else, behaved like an old friend. I kept thinking about the light while he made us tea. I kept replaying that instant where the yard went from ordinary to near daylight, and how the roses looked like they'd been sketched in white. I felt silly and small for being thrown by a blink of brightness, but a part of me had been unsettled in a way I couldn't name. The ordinary things of the house, mug handle, tea steam, the soft ticking of the clock, were a small, precise proof that the world had not ended, not even a little. We didn't tell anyone. Who would you tell? I thought of calling the neighbor who charts weather out of habit. I thought of the city police or an astronomer at the university. And then the practical pile formed again. You have patients in the morning, bills, a child's rehearsal. The list of what must be done shrank the night down to normal size. I wrote a note and left it in my phone. Saw a bright skylight, 11:38 p.m. No details, just a stub of evidence. That night I woke twice and went to the window because habit is an odd form of superstitious logic. The sky was the same as it had been before. Stars, moon bit in a sliver. Rosie slept in her crate, lungs slow and steady. The next evening, the news was full of a local council meeting about zoning, nothing about lights or sky phenomena. The week after that, I walked the yard in daylight and looked for any scorch on the grass, a melted leaf, anything to explain the intensity of the brightness. There was nothing unusual, just the ordinary tracks of the sprinklers and the faint ring where a bird had pecked last week. Sometimes I caught myself staring up, waiting for the star to flare like a hand turning a switch. I kept expecting some repeat, a pattern, a reason. Life resumed its usual steady sequence: work, dinner, the town routine. The note on my phone sat there like a small relic. Saw a bright skylight, 11:38 p.m. I read it sometimes, like reading an odd sentence someone else had written about the world. I don't have a tidy explanation. I only have the memory of that sudden high white light, the way it sharpened shadows and flattened color, and the fact that by the time Evan reached the porch, the sky had closed its mouth and resumed the business of being night. The garden looked the same as it always had, the roses no paler than before, and the maple's leaves resumed being nothing more than leaves against the sky. The event folded itself into the night with the quiet persistence of some things that don't need telling. I climbed onto the roof around midnight, careful not to wake my parents. The night air was cool for late June, carrying that wet smell of the grass after the occasional afternoon rain. My name's Eli Hammond, 16, and this was one of those nights I just felt like getting away from everything. The house, my little brother snoring in his room, the quiet, suffocating hum of suburbia. I had my old blanket rolled up under my arm and a flashlight in my pocket, though I wasn't planning to turn it on. The neighborhood was dead quiet. Usually I'd hear crickets, a dog barking somewhere down Pine Street, tires rolling over asphalt. That night, none of it. I made it to the roof, the shingles warm and rough under my sneakers. I sat down, swung my legs over the edge, and just stared up. The sky was clear, the stars unusually bright. Orion was there, Betelgeuse glowing faintly red, the Milky Way slicing across the blackness. It was perfect for stargazing. I remember seeing it almost immediately. A circular patch of sky that was darker than everything else, a void where no stars existed. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes. I assumed it was some cloud catching the moonlight, but the patch was perfectly round. Sharp edges like someone had cut it out with a stencil. And it wasn't moving with the clouds. It was still. I leaned back a little, trying to see if it was just a trick of my eyes. But then it started to glide, slowly, silently, over the house across the street. I froze, gripping the edge of the roof. The patch moved smoothly. No wobble, no flicker, no sound. Not a plane, not a helicopter, not a drone. My stomach tightened, and I had that weird sense you get when you know something's real but can't figure out what it is. I almost called my little brother up to look, but I stopped myself. It was too weird, too quiet. If someone else saw it, they'd freak. I didn't want anyone around. I just sat there, eyes locked on that dark circle moving across the stars. It wasn't fast, not like a shooting star or anything mechanical. It moved like someone dragging a black sheet across the sky. After a minute that felt like hours, it disappeared. Just gone, like someone had erased it. I sat frozen, staring at the same patch of sky that was now filled with stars, perfectly normal. I checked around, half expecting to see something perched on the roof next to me, a shadow of some kind. Nothing. Just the night, quiet, ordinary. I climbed down as carefully as I had climbed up, knees shaking, stomach tight. In my room, I tried to convince myself it was a shadow, a cloud, a trick of the moon. But nothing matched it. I lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the house settle, listening to the normal hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of my clock. The normality was comforting and terrifying at the same time. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about it. At school, I caught myself staring out the windows at lunch, scanning the sky for that same patch, trying to catch it again. I'd tell myself it was a dream or my imagination, but it felt too real. When I closed my eyes, I could see it. A perfect, dark circle moving silently, untouched by the stars it passed over. I tried to look it up, figure out if anyone else had seen anything like it. I didn't tell anyone at school. My friends would have laughed, called me crazy, said I was looking too much at the stars instead of my phone. The more I tried to rationalize it, the less sense it made. Clouds aren't perfectly circular, planes don't swallow stars without a trace, and nothing that moves silently like that exists in textbooks. I went out a few more nights after that, hoping to see it again. Nothing. The skies were normal. Crickets, a few distant dogs, streetlights glowing softly against the trees. It was like it had only been there for me, just that night, and then vanished completely. I think about it every so often. When I'm lying in bed on a warm night, windows open, the suburb quiet except for the occasional car, I glance up. I wonder if it's still out there, somewhere over the horizon, gliding silently. Or if it was a one-time thing, impossible to ever explain. I don't chase it anymore. I don't climb onto the roof at midnight. But the memory is there, like a crease in my vision that I can't smooth out. That circular patch of sky, darker than everything else, moving slowly, silently, and then gone. Nothing explains it. Nothing fits. And somehow, even thinking about it makes the world feel a little less ordinary than it did before. I'm not sure what it was, or why I saw it, or if I imagined any of it at all. But it was real enough for me that night. Real enough to make me sit on a roof and just watch the sky, wondering if anyone else in the world had seen it too. I had arrived at the cabin late Friday afternoon, carrying a duffel bag and a small cooler. The road up from the highway was nothing but gravel, winding through dense pine and birch, and by the time I pulled into the small clearing, the sun was dipping low, turning the sky a muddy orange. My name's Claire Monroe, and I'd rented this lakeside cabin to get away from the city for a week, to write, think, and just be alone for a while. The cabin itself was small but cozy, perched just a few yards from the water's edge. I spent the first hour unpacking, lighting the wood stove, and staring out the window at the lake. The water was calm, glassy, reflecting the early evening sky perfectly. Everything felt normal, peaceful. That night, after dinner, I decided to take a short walk along the shore. The moon was rising, low over the tree line, silver light spilling across the water. It was quiet, no insects buzzing, no distant calls from the woods, just the gentle lapping of water against the rocks. I stopped halfway down the dock, peering at my reflection in the lake when I noticed a ripple. A broad, slow ripple, like something heavy had slid just beneath the surface. I froze, thinking maybe a fish, though nothing this large should have been here at this time of year. The water settled again, the reflection of the moon returning to smooth silver. I squinted, scanning the lake. Nothing moved. No wake, no splash, nothing. I shook my head and laughed quietly to myself, thinking I'd been spooked by shadows or the wind shifting under the trees. I walked back to the cabin. But when I glanced out the window later, I noticed the surface again. The moonlight struck the lake at just the right angle, and I could see faint ripples creeping outward, as though something large had submerged in the middle of the lake. But when I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the same spot, there was nothing, just moonlight, dark water, and the faint reflection of stars. I tried to focus on my writing, forcing myself to ignore it. I told myself I was tired, maybe imagining movement. I worked for a while at the small desk by the window, scribbling in my notebook, when I caught a faint glimmer beneath the water. Something that wasn't there before. A soft white glow, shifting slowly, as though it were pulsing beneath the surface. My stomach tightened. I leaned closer to the glass, eyes wide, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't see a shape, just the faint, steady light under the water. I set the notebook down and stepped outside, cold air brushing my face, the dock creaking under my weight. The glow seemed to retreat slightly as I approached, moving just beyond the reach of the moonlight. I raised my flashlight again, sweeping over the water. Nothing. Just black, mirrored surface, as though the lake had swallowed the glow entirely. The feeling hit me then. Unease, but not panic. It wasn't malicious, not like some predator, but it was aware. There was a presence. I stayed at the edge of the dock, frozen, watching. The ripples returned, gentle, almost lazy, spreading across the water, but still no splash, no disturbance beyond the surface. My mind raced. Fish don't glow. Otters don't make the water shimmer like this, and the lake wasn't deep enough for anything that size to be hiding undisturbed. I considered calling someone, anyone, but for what? Hello? Yes, I'm at a cabin, and there's a glowing thing under the water. I laughed quietly at myself. Ridiculous. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I stayed out there for maybe 20 minutes, watching as the glow pulsed faintly, rising and sinking slowly, and then it vanished. Just gone, leaving nothing but ripples fading into glassy calm. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and checked the water from different angles. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the moon as though nothing had happened. I went back inside, sat at the window, and watched the lake from there. The quiet was total now, almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I couldn't see the glow anymore. I tried to convince myself it had been bioluminescent algae, though I knew that didn't bloom like that in late October, and certainly not with a pulse, not moving like it had. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening. The cabin creaked, the fire popped, and every so often I'd glance at the lake, half expecting to see the glow return. But nothing. The next morning, I went out early, skimming stones across the still water. Everything appeared normal in the daylight. No glow, no ripples, nothing. The lake was calm, like a regular lake, the way it should be. I tried to explain it to myself over coffee on the porch. Reflection, fatigue, imagination. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that soft light pulsing beneath the surface, drifting slowly in the shadows of the lake bed. I didn't see it again during my stay. I swam in the afternoon, fished along the shore, and took long hikes into the surrounding woods. Nothing unusual occurred, and yet when I'd look at the lake, I felt a weight like something unseen was watching just below the surface. I left the cabin after a week, packing my things quietly, the lake calm and silent behind me. On the drive back down the gravel road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shimmer trailing me in the tree line or a reflection in the water I'd just left. There was nothing. Back in the city, I told no one about it. Not really. People would laugh or chalk it up to cabin nerves or tired eyes, but sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I see that faint, steady glow. I see it under the moonlight, drifting slowly beneath the surface, and I remember the way the lake went utterly silent as it hovered, pulsing beneath the water, aware of me, though I could never find it again. I don't know what it was, and I don't try to. I just know what I saw. And some nights I swear I can still feel it watching from under the water, waiting, silent and steady, in a lake that should be perfectly ordinary. I was halfway between the highway and the split that takes you down to Maple Street when I first noticed the light in my rear view. It looked like a headlight at first, a soft round glow, the color of a flashlight through fog, but there was no one behind me close enough for headlights to show up that big. I checked the mirror again, slow and casual like I always do. expecting to see a taillight or a pickup truck. Nothing, just a pale point of light hanging low, staying put in the mirror as if it were stuck to the glass. I drove on. It was late, just after midnight, and I should have been tired. I had worked the late shift at the clinic, charting and emptying the break room coffee, thinking about the pile of laundry at home. The road was the usual ribbon, 2 lanes, white paint, the faint orange of distant sodium lamps. The radio was a low hum of static and half-hearted country songs. Outside the windows, the trees leaned in like they were listening. The light stayed directly in the center of the mirror, no matter how I adjusted my head. When I glanced at the dash, the clock read 12:14. I told myself it was a reflection from somewhere up the valley. A farmhouse, maybe. A hunting camp light I hadn't noticed. That sounded fine until I took the exit that drops off the highway and onto the county road. Slow speed, the way you always do. The glow in the mirror slowed with me, keeping that same distance. It wasn't approaching, it simply mirrored my motion. A car did finally catch up to me at a long crest and passed, its taillights blinking red in the mirror. For a second, the little bright thing flickered against the passing lights, and I thought maybe that explained it. A distant, fixed light on a hill, magnified by the curve of the mirror. But when the taillights had passed and there was nothing but my own empty lane, the small glow reasserted itself, steady and faint, like a memory of light. My hands tightened on the wheel. I tried to describe it in my head. Not warm, not like yellow street lamps. It had a thin, almost paper-white quality, as if someone had tucked a small moon into a jar. The road narrowed, and the shoulder dropped away into scrub. Somewhere a dog barked, twice, then quiet. On the crest of a hill, I flicked on the brights for a beat out of habit, and the glow didn't react. It sat there, indifferent. I took the county road that cuts under the ridgeline because it was quieter than the main road, even at that hour. The map app on my phone was asleep in the passenger seat. I'd turned it off to save the battery. I remember thinking for a second that wasn't important, just a practical thing. Then the little light in the mirror shifted, like it was nudged, so that it now sat a little to the left in the glass, as if it were tracking something behind me. I rolled the window down for fresh air because the car felt stuffy. The night smelled like rain left over in the asphalt, clean and dark. There were more leaves on the road than usual, slick and black. The hum of traffic on the main road was gone. The hum in the quiet after that was the only thing that sat wrong. Not a sound of any one thing, more a presence of stillness that seemed to thicken everything else. When I pulled up behind a truck, able to make the winding county road at the posted speed, the glow positioned itself exactly in line with the truck's trough of red taillights, but slightly dimmer. If I eased forward to pass, it shifted with me, always keeping that small space between us. When I fell back, it fell back. I kept thinking I would turn around at the next turnout and check, see some idiot parked on the shoulder with a lantern. But there was nowhere to turn safely on that stretch. The only break was a narrow church parking lot a mile farther, and by then my palms were steady, but I found myself not wanting to reach for the wheel more than necessary. I had this image in my head of the light being something private to the road, something that didn't care if it had an audience. I passed mile markers and mailboxes I could normally recite without thinking. At one point, a deer stood at the edge of the trees and watched me, eyes reflecting in a way that made them look like 2 small coins. The deer didn't spook as I slowed. It blinked and turned away, and for a moment the calm of that animal made the glow in the mirror feel less alien. It didn't answer to anything, so I kept going. My phone vibrated in the seat next to me. A text from Maria asking if I was coming by in the morning. Nothing important, the kind of domestic thing that usually pulled me right out of a fog. I ignored it. When I did look, the mirror showed nothing different, but now the light in the glass seemed higher, like it had lifted with the angle of the road or the tilt of my car. Maybe I was inventing the movements, or maybe my mind was compensating for the fact that it refused to be anything ordinary. At the intersection before the stretch of road with the softball field, the streetlights flickered, a quick, city-style dip, once, twice, like an electrical system clearing a power surge. My headlights dipped too, shadows stacking briefly across the dashboard, and for a beat, my car felt like it was holding its breath. When the lights came back, the glow in the mirror had doubled. There were now two pale points spaced a little apart like a pair of distant eyes. I pulled off the road into a grocery store parking lot because my brain needed the ordinary geometry of overhead lights and painted lanes. I sat with the engine on and the shifter in park, and the glow, whether one spot or two, sat right in the mirror the way someone sits expectant at the edge of a chair. There was no sound, no rustle beyond the store's humming freezer units. A long-haul semi rolled in and turned under the sodium bulbs, and for a moment the mirror was a confetti of lights, and then the semi took off, and the glow was alone again. I opened my mouth to laugh at myself and closed it. The laugh felt brittle. When I pulled back onto the road, the light followed without drama. It kept the same distance, whether I was doing 30 or 60, no tailgating, no urging, just a patient alignment to my rear view. I went through town, and the glow hung in the mirror above the wink of apartment windows and the low sweep of the creek. A pair of teenagers leaned against their car on the corner laughing at something. They didn't notice me. The normality of those small, stupid moments made the thing in the mirror seem stranger by contrast. The minutes stretched. I thought about flicking on the hazards and stopping on the shoulder to look in the rear view and see exactly what was following me, but the idea felt like a test I wasn't ready to take. I didn't like the idea of revealing myself as the only attentive thing on the road. I kept my speed, hands at 9 and 3, and breathed in the scent of my coffee warming in the cup holder. When I finally turned onto my street, the one lined with maples that throw down a canopy and narrow the road to one lane, the glow backed off a hair. I told myself that must be coincidence. Maybe streetlights on smaller roads scatter distant light differently. My house was a quarter-mile down, and I signaled and eased into the turn, the way a person who has driven the same route all their life does. The porch light across the road sputtered on and then was steady. A neighbor's window lamp switched off. The moment the tires climbed the small curb into my driveway, the light in the mirror blinked once, like a slow shutter snap, and then it was gone. Not faded, not moved out of frame, gone as if the world had flipped a switch I didn't know existed. I sat there with the car idling and the radio playing nothing louder than a test tone. Outside, my yard looked the way it always did. The gash of shadow under the maple, the folded rug on the porch from where I'd left it drying. My hands shook a little as I reached up and adjusted the mirror, making sure it wasn't glued or stained. Inside, everything seemed the same as when I'd left. The kettle I never seemed to remember turning off was cold. Lights on the counters were off. Maria's truck wasn't in the driveway. She was staying at her sister's, she had said. I told myself to make tea, check the answers on the charts, call Maria about coming by in the morning. The ordinary chores had an orchestrating effect, arranging the night's edges back into the shape I recognized. I don't know how long I sat in the quiet before I turned the key and walked up the steps. The light had vanished from the mirror without a trace. It might have been a reflection, a trick of terrain and distant lamps, a hunter's lantern on a ridgeline, something perfectly explainable. And I tried that explanation on more than once, like a coat that almost fit. But none of the fits felt complete. The way it had matched me lane for lane, the way it had doubled for a breath, the timing of the flicker at the exact moment I pulled into my drive, those were details that sat in my chest and refused to be smoothed over. I shut the car door softly and carried the small heat of it up the walk. The porch light buzzed when I reached for the switch. Inside, the clock on the microwave read 12:47. I worried first about the work I'd left undone. Then I worried about nothing at all, the kind of empty worry that follows a thing you can't explain. I stepped inside and flicked on the kitchen light, the familiar warm yellow washing out the edges of the night. When I lay down that night, I kept one ear tuned to the house, the refrigerator's low purr, the street's distant sigh, the maple's leaves agreeing with the wind. The world kept to its own business. The glow didn't return. The mirror on the car outside was ordinary glass. I told myself I had seen what I'd seen, and that was that. And then I tried to fall asleep, which is how I always ended the strange nights, by pretending the ordinary was enough.